a cheerful temper. From my father I received the best inheritance, namely, a good temper. And who was my father? That has nothing to do with the good temper, but I will say he was lively, good-looking round, and fat. He was both in appearance and character, a complete contradiction to his profession. And pray, what was his profession and his standing in respectable society? Well, perhaps, if in the beginning of a book these were written and printed, many, when they read it, would lay the book down and say, "It seems to me a very miserable title. I don't like things of this sort." And yet my father was not a skin dresser, nor an executioner. On the contrary, his employment placed him at the head of the grandest people of the town, and it was his place by right. He had to precede the bishop, and even the princes of the blood. He always went first. He was a hearse driver. There, now, the truth is out. And I will own that when people saw my father perched up in front of the omnibus of death, dressed in his long, wide black cloak, and his black-edged, three-cornered hat on his head, and then glanced at his round, jocund face, round as the sun, they could not think much of sorrow or the grave. That face said, "It is nothing. It will all end better than people think." So I have inherited from him not only my good temper, but a habit of going often to the churchyard, which is good when done in a proper humour. And then also I take in the Intelligencer, just as he used to do. I am not very young. I have neither wife nor children nor a library, but, as I said, I read the Intelligencer, which is enough for me. It is to me a delightful paper, and so it was to my father. It is of great use, for it contains all that a man requires to know, the names of the preachers at the church, and the new books which are published, where houses, servants, clothes, and provisions may be obtained. And then what a number of subscriptions to charities, and what innocent verses! Persons seeking interviews and engagements, all so plainly and naturally stated. Certainly, a man who takes in the Intelligencer may live merrily and be buried contentedly, and by the end of his life will have such a capital stock of paper that he can lie on a soft bed of it, unless he prefers wood shavings for his resting place. The newspaper and the churchyard were always exciting objects to me. My walks to the latter were like bathing places to my good humour. Everyone can read the newspaper for himself. But come with me to the churchyard while the sun shines and the trees are green, and let us wander among the graves. Each of them is like a closed book, with the back uppermost, on which we can read the title of what the book contains, but nothing more. I had a great deal of information from my father, and I have noticed a great deal myself. I keep it in my diary, in which I write for my own use and pleasure a history of all who lie here, and a few more beside. Now we are in the churchyard. Here, behind the white iron railings, once a rose tree grew. It is gone now, but a little bit of evergreen from a neighbouring grave stretches out its green tendrils and makes some appearance. There rests a very unhappy man, and yet while he lived he might be said to occupy a very good position. He had enough to live upon, and something to spare, but owing to his refined tastes, the least thing in the world annoyed him. If he went to a theatre of an evening, instead of enjoying himself, he would be quite annoyed if the machinist had put too strong a light into one side of the moon, or if the representations of the sky hung over the scenes when they ought to have hung behind them, or if a palm tree was introduced into a scene representing the zoological gardens of Berlin, or a cactus in a view of Tyrol, or a beech tree in the north of Norway. As if these things were of any consequence. Why did he not leave them alone? Who would trouble themselves about such trifles, especially at a comedy, where everyone is expected to be amused? Then sometimes the public applauded too much or too little to please him. "They are like wet wood," he would say, looking round to see what sort of people were present. "This evening nothing fires them." Then he would vex and fret himself because they did not laugh at the right time, or because they laughed in the wrong places, and so he fretted and worried himself till at last the unhappy man fretted himself into the grave. Here rests a happy man, that is to say, a man of high birth and position, which was very lucky for him, otherwise he would have been scarcely worth notice. It is beautiful to observe how wisely nature orders these things. He walked about in a coat embroidered all over, and in the drawing-rooms of society looked just like one of those rich pearl-embroidered bell-pulls which are only made for show, and behind them always hangs a good thick cord for use. This man also had a stout, useful substitute behind him, who did duty for him, and performed all his dirty work. And there are still, even now, these serviceable cords behind other embroidered bell ropes. It is all so wisely arranged that a man may well be in a good humour. Here rests, it makes one feel mournful to think of him. But here rests a man who, during 67 years, was never remembered to have said a good thing. He lived only in the hope of having a good idea. At last he felt convinced in his own mind that he really had one, and was so delighted that he positively died of joy at the thought of having at last caught an idea. Nobody got anything by it, indeed. No one even heard what the good thing was. Now I can imagine that this same idea may prevent him from resting quietly in his grave. For suppose that to produce a good effect, it is necessary to bring out his new idea at breakfast, and that he can only make his appearance on earth at midnight, as ghosts are believed generally to do, why then this good idea would not suit the hour, and the man would have to carry it down again with him into the grave. That must be a troubled grave. The woman who lies here was so remarkably stingy that during her life she would get up in the night and mew, that her neighbours might think she kept a cat. What a miser she was! Here rests a young lady of a good family who would always make her voice heard in society, and when she sang "Mi manca la voce," it was the only true thing she ever said in her life. Here lies a maiden of another description. She was engaged to be married, but her story is one of everyday life. We will leave her to rest in the grave. Here rests a widow who, with music in her tongue, carried gall in her heart. She used to go round among the families near and search out their faults, upon which she preyed with all the envy and malice of her nature. This is a family grave. The members of this family held so firmly together in their opinions that they would believe in no other. If the newspapers, or even the whole world, said of a certain subject, "It is so and so," and a little schoolboy declared he had learned quite differently, they would take his assertion as the only true one, because he belonged to the family. And it is well known that if the yard-cock belonging to this family happened to crow at midnight, they would declare it was morning, although the watchman and all the clocks in the town were proclaiming the hour of 12 at night. The great poet Goethe concludes his Faust with the words, "May be continued." So might our wanderings in the churchyard be continued. I come here often, and if any of my friends, or those who are not my friends, are too much for me, I go out and choose a plot of ground in which to bury him or her. Then I bury them, as it were. There they lie, dead and powerless, till they come back new and better characters, their lives and their deeds, looked at after my own fashion, I write down in my diary, as everyone ought to do. Then, if any of our friends act absurdly, no one need to be vexed about it. Let them bury the offenders out of sight and keep their good temper. They can also read the Intelligencer, which is a paper written by the people, with their hands guided. When the time comes for the history of my life to be bound by the grave, then they will write upon it as my epitaph. The man with a cheerful temper. A great grief. This story really consists of two parts. The first part might be left out, but it gives us a few particulars, and these are useful. We were staying in the country at a gentleman's seat, where it happened that the master was absent for a few days. In the meantime, there arrived from the next town a lady. She had a pug dog with her, and came, she said, to dispose of shares in her tan yard. She had her papers with her, and we advised her to put them in an envelope, and to write thereon the address of the proprietor of the estate, General War Commissary Knight, N.C. She listened to us attentively, seized the pen, paused, and begged us to repeat the direction slowly. We complied, and she wrote, "But in the midst of the general war?" She struck fast, sighed deeply, and said, "I am only a woman." Her puggy had seated itself on the ground while she wrote, and growled, for the dog had come with her for amusement and for the sake of its health, and then the bare floor ought not to be offered to a visitor. His outward appearance was characterized by a snub nose and a very fat back. "He doesn't bite," said the lady. "He has no teeth. He is like one of the family, faithful and grumpy, but the latter is my grandchildren's fault, for they have teased him. They play at wedding, and want to give him the part of the bridesmaid, and that's too much for him, poor old fellow." And she delivered her papers, and took Puggy upon her arm, and this is the first part of the story, which might have been left out. Puggy died! That's the second part. It was about a week afterwards we arrived in the town, and put up at the inn. Our windows looked into the tan yard, which was divided into two parts by a partition of planks. In one half were many skins and hides, raw and tanned. Here was all the apparatus necessary to carry on a tannery, and it belonged to the widow. Puggy had died in the morning, and was to be buried in this part of the yard. The grandchildren of the widow, that is, of the tanner's widow, for Puggy had never been married, filled up the grave, and it was a beautiful grave. It must have been quite pleasant to lie there. The grave was bordered with pieces of flower pots and strewn over with sand. Quite at the top they had stuck up half a beer bottle, with the neck upwards, and that was not at all allegorical. The children danced round the grave, and the eldest of the boys among them, a practical youngster of 7 years, made the proposition that there should be an exhibition of Puggy's burial place for all who lived in the lane. The price of admission was to be a trouser button, for every boy would be sure to have one, and each might also give one for a little girl. This proposal was adopted by acclamation, and all the children out of the lane, yes, even out of the little lane at the back, flocked to the place, and each gave a button. Many were noticed to go about on that afternoon with only one suspender. But then they had seen Puggy's grave, and the sight was worth much more. But in front of the tan yard, close to the entrance, stood a little girl clothed in rags, very pretty to look at, with curly hair, and eyes so blue and clear that it was a pleasure to look into them. The child said not a word, nor did she cry, but each time the little door was opened, she gave a long, long look into the yard. She had not a button, that she knew right well, and therefore she remained standing sorrowfully outside till all the others had seen the grave and had gone away. Then she sat down, held her little brown hands before her eyes, and burst into tears. This girl alone had not seen Puggy's grave. It was a grief as great to her as any grown person can experience. We saw this from above, and looked at from above how many a grief of our own and of others can make us smile. That is the story. and whoever does not understand it may go and purchase a share in the tan-yard from the window. A leaf from heaven. Heaven, high up in the clear, pure air, flew an angel with a flower plucked from the garden of heaven. As he was kissing the flower, a very little leaf fell from it and sunk down into the soft earth in the middle of a wood. It immediately took root, sprouted, and sent out shoots among the other plants. "What a ridiculous little shoot," said one. "No one will recognize it, not even the thistle nor the stinging nettle." "It must be a kind of garden plant," said another, and so they sneered and despised the plant as a thing from a garden. "Where are you coming?" said the tall thistles, whose leaves were all armed with thorns. "It is stupid nonsense to allow yourself to shoot out in this way. We are not here to support you." Winter came, and the plant was covered with snow, but the snow glittered over it as if it had sunshine beneath as well as above. When spring came, the plant appeared in full bloom, a more beautiful object than any other plant in the forest. And now the professor of botany presented himself, one who could explain his knowledge in black and white. He examined and tested the plant, but it did not belong to his system of botany, nor could he possibly find out to what class it did belong. "It must be some degenerate species," said he. "I do not know it, and it is not mentioned in any system." "Not known in any system," repeated the thistles and the nettles. The large trees which grew round it saw the plant and heard the remarks, but they said not a word, either good or bad, which is the wisest plan for those who are ignorant. There passed through the forest a poor innocent girl. Her heart was pure, and her understanding increased by her faith. Her chief inheritance had been an old Bible, which she read and valued. From its pages she heard the voice of God speaking to her, and telling her to remember what was said of Joseph's brethren when persons wished to injure her. They imagined evil in their hearts, but God turned it to good. If we suffer wrongfully, if we are misunderstood or despised, we must think of him who was pure and holy, and who prayed for those who nailed him to the cross. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The girl stood still before the wonderful plant, for the green leaves exhaled a sweet and refreshing fragrance, and the flowers glittered and sparkled in the sunshine like colored flames, and the harmony of sweet sounds lingered round them as if each concealed within itself a deep fount of melody, which thousands of years could not exhaust. With pious gratitude, the girl looked upon this glorious work of God, and bent down over one of the branches, that she might examine the flower and inhale the sweet perfume. Then a light broke in on her mind, and her heart expanded. Gladly would she have plucked a flower, but she could not overcome her reluctance to break one off. She knew it would so soon fade, so she took only a single green leaf, carried it home, and laid it in her Bible, where it remained evergreen, fresh, and unfading. Between the pages of the Bible it still lay when, a few weeks afterwards, that Bible was laid under the young girl's head in her coffin. A holy calm rested on her face, as if the earthly remains bore the impress of the truth that she now stood in the presence of God. In the forest the wonderful plant still continued to bloom till it grew and became almost a tree, and all the birds of passage bowed themselves before it. "That plant is a foreigner, no doubt," said the thistles and the burdocks. "We can never conduct ourselves like that in this country." And the black forest snails actually spat at the flower. Then came the swineherd. He was collecting thistles and shrubs to burn them for the ashes. He pulled up the wonderful plant, roots and all, and placed it in his bundle. "This will be as useful as any," he said, so the plant was carried away. Not long after, the king of the country suffered from the deepest melancholy. He was diligent and industrious, but employment did him no good. They read deep and learned books to him, and then the lightest and most trifling that could be found, but all to no purpose. Then they applied for advice to one of the wise men of the world, and he sent them a message to say that there was one remedy which would relieve and cure him, and that it was a plant of heavenly origin which grew in the forest in the king's own dominions. The messenger described the flower so that his appearance could not be mistaken. Then said the swineherd, "I am afraid I carried this plant away from the forest in my bundle, and it has been burnt to ashes long ago, but I did not know any better." "You did not know any better? Ignorance upon ignorance indeed." The poor swineherd took these words to heart, for they were addressed to him. He knew not that there were others who were equally ignorant. Not even a leaf of the plant could be found. There was one, but it lay in the coffin of the dead. No one knew anything about it. Then the king, in his melancholy, wandered out to the spot in the wood. "Here is where the plant stood," he said. "It is a sacred place." Then he ordered that the place should be surrounded with a golden railing and a sentry stationed near it. The botanical professor wrote a long treatise about the heavenly plant, and for this he was loaded with gold, which improved the position of himself and his family. And this part is really the most pleasant part of the story, for the plant had disappeared, and the king remained as melancholy and sad as ever. But the sentry said he had always been so, a Ros, from Homer's grave. All the songs of the East speak of the love of the nightingale for the rose in the silent starlight night. The winged songster serenades the fragrant flowers, not far from Smyrna, where the merchant drives his loaded camels, proudly arching their long necks as they journey beneath the lofty pines over holy ground. I saw a hedge of roses. The turtle-dove flew among the branches of the tall trees, and as the sunbeams fell upon her wings, they glistened as if they were mother of pearl. On the rose-bush grew a flower, more beautiful than them all, and to her the nightingale sung of his woes, but the rose remained silent. Not even a dewdrop lay like a tear of sympathy on her leaves. At last she bowed her head over a heap of stones and said, "Here rests the greatest singer in the world. Over his tomb will I spread my fragrance, and on it I will let my leaves fall when the storm scatters them. He who sung of Troy became earth, and from that earth I have sprung. I, a rose from the grave of Homer, am too lofty to bloom for a nightingale." Then the nightingale sung himself to death. A camel-driver came by. With his loaded camels and his black slaves, his little son found the dead bird and buried the lovely songster in the grave of the great Homer, while the rose trembled in the wind. The evening came, and the rose wrapped her leaves more closely round her and dreamed, and this was her dream. It was a fair, sunshiny day. A crowd of strangers drew near who had undertaken a pilgrimage to the grave of Homer. Among the strangers was a minstrel from the north, the home of the clouds and the brilliant lights of the aurora borealis. He plucked the rose and placed it in a book, and carried it away into a distant part of the world, his fatherland. The rose faded with grief and lay between the leaves of the book, which he opened in his own home, saying, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." Then the flower awoke from her dream and trembled in the wind. A drop of dew fell from the leaves upon the singer's grave. The sun rose, and the flower bloomed more beautiful than ever. The day was hot, and she was still in her own warm Asia. Then footsteps approached. Strangers, such as the rose had seen in her dream, came by, and among them was a poet from the north. He plucked the rose, pressed a kiss upon her fresh mouth, and carried her away to the home of the clouds and the northern lights. Like a mummy, the flower now rests in his Iliad. And, as in her dream, she hears him say as he opens the book, "Here is a rose from the grave of Homer." A story from the sand. Hills, this story is from the sand dunes or sand hills of Jutland, but it does not begin there in the north, but far away in the south, in Spain. The wide sea is the high road from nation to nation. Journey in thought, then, to sunny Spain. It is warm and beautiful there. The fiery pomegranate flowers peep from among dark laurels. A cool, refreshing breeze from the mountains blows over the orange gardens, over the Moorish halls with their golden cupolas and coloured walls. Children go through the streets in procession with candles and waving banners, and the sky, lofty and clear with its glittering stars, rises above them. Sounds of singing and castanets can be heard, and youths and maidens dance upon the flowering acacia trees, while even the beggar sits upon a block of marble, refreshing himself with a juicy melon and dreamily enjoying life. It all seems like a beautiful dream. Here dwelt a newly married couple, who completely gave themselves up to the charm of life. Indeed, they possessed every good thing they could desire: health and happiness, riches and honor. "We are as happy as human beings can be," said the young couple from the depths of their hearts. They had indeed only one step higher to mount on the ladder of happiness. They hoped that God would give them a child, a son like them in form and spirit. The happy little one was to be welcomed with rejoicing, to be cared for with love and tenderness, and enjoy every advantage of wealth and luxury that a rich and influential family can give. So, the days went by like a joyous festival. "Life is a gracious gift from God, almost too great a gift for us to appreciate," said the young wife. "Yet they say that fullness of joy for ever and ever can only be found in the future life. I cannot realize it." "The thought arises, perhaps, from the arrogance of men," said the husband. "It seems a great pride to believe that we shall live forever, that we shall be as gods. Were not these the words of the serpent, the father of lies? Surely you do not doubt the existence of a future life?" exclaimed the young wife. It seemed as if one of the first shadows passed over her sunny thoughts. "Faith realizes it, and the priests tell us so," replied her husband. "But amid all my happiness, I feel that it is arrogant to demand a continuation of it. Another life after this has not so much been given us in this world that we ought to be, we must be, contented with it?" "Yes, it has been given to us," said the young wife, "but this life is nothing more than one long scene of trial and hardship to many thousands. How many have been cast into this world only to endure poverty, shame, illness, and misfortune? If there were no future life, everything here would be too unequally divided, and God would not be the personification of justice." "The beggar there," said her husband, "has joys of his own which seem to him great, and cause him as much pleasure as a king would find in the magnificence of his palace. And then do you not think that the beast of burden, which suffers blows and hunger, and works itself to death, suffers just as much from its miserable fate? The dumb creature might demand a future life also, and declare the law unjust that excludes it from the advantages of the higher creation." Christ said, "In my Father's house are many mansions," she answered. "Heaven is as boundless as the love of our Creator. The dumb animal is also His creature. And I firmly believe that no life will be lost, but each will receive as much happiness as he can enjoy, which will be sufficient for him." "This world is sufficient for me," said the husband, throwing his arm round his beautiful, sweet-tempered wife. He sat by her side on the open balcony, smoking a cigarette in the cool air, which was loaded with the sweet scent of carnations and orange blossoms. Sounds of music and the clatter of castanets came from the road beneath. The stars shone above then, and two eyes full of affection Those of his wife looked upon him with the expression of undying love. "Such a moment," he said, "makes it worth while to be born, to die, and to be annihilated." He smiled. The young wife raised her hand in gentle reproof, and the shadow passed away from her mind. And they were happy, quite happy. Everything seemed to work together for their good. They advanced in honor, in prosperity, and in happiness. A change came, certainly, but it was only a change of place, and not of circumstances. The young man was sent by his sovereign as ambassador to the Russian court. This was an office of high dignity, but his birth and his acquirements entitled him to the honor. He possessed a large fortune, and his wife had brought him wealth equal to his own, for she was the daughter of a rich and respected merchant. One of this merchant's largest and finest ships was to be sent that year to Stockholm, and it was arranged that the dear young couple, the daughter and the son-in-law, should travel in it to St. Petersburg. All the arrangements on board were princely and silk and luxury on every side. In an old war song called "The King of England's Son," it says, "Farewell," he said, and sailed away. And many recollect that day. The ropes were of silk, the anchor of gold, and everywhere riches and wealth untold. These words would aptly describe the vessel from Spain, for here was the same luxury, and the same parting thought naturally arose. God grant that we once more may meet in sweet unclouded peace and joy. There was a favourable wind blowing as they left the Spanish coast, and it would be but a short journey, for they hoped to reach their destination in a few weeks. But when they came out upon the wide ocean, the wind dropped, the sea became smooth and shining, and the stars shone brightly. Many festive evenings were spent on board. At last the travellers began to wish for wind, for a favourable breeze, but their wish was useless. Not a breath of air stirred, or if it did arise, it was contrary. Weeks passed by in this way, 2 whole months, and then at length a fair wind blew from the southwest. The ship sailed on the high seas between Scotland and Jutland. Then the wind increased, just as it did in the old song of "The King of England's Son." Mid storm and wind and pelting hail, their efforts were of no avail. The golden anchor forth they threw, towards Denmark the west wind blew. This all happened a long time ago. King Christian VII, who sat on the Danish throne, was still a young man. Much has happened since then, much has altered or been changed. Sea and moorland have been turned into green meadows, stretches of heather have become arable land, and in the shelter of the peasants' cottages, apple trees and rose bushes grow, though they certainly require much care, as the sharp west wind blows upon them. In West Jutland one may go back in thought to old times, farther back than the days when Christian VII ruled. The purple heather still extends for miles, with its barrows and aerial spectacles, intersected with sandy, uneven roads, just as it did then, towards the west, where broad streams run into the bays, are marshes and meadows encircled by lofty, sandy hills, which, like a chain of Alps, raise their pointed summits near the sea. They are only broken by high ridges of clay, from which the sea, year by year, bites out great mouthfuls, so that the overhanging banks fall down as if by the shock of an earthquake. Thus it is there today, and thus it was long ago, when the happy pair were sailing in the beautiful ship. It was a Sunday, towards the end of September. The sun was shining, and the chiming of the church bells in the Bay of Nissum was carried along by the breeze like a chain of sounds. The churches there are almost entirely built of hewn blocks of stone, each like a piece of rock. The North Sea might foam over them, and they would not be disturbed. Nearly all of them are without steeples, and the bells are hung outside between 2 beams. The service was over, and the congregation passed out into the churchyard, where not a tree or bush was to be seen. No flowers were planted there, and they had not placed a single wreath upon any of the graves. It is just the same now. Rough mounds show where the dead have been buried, and rank grass, tossed by the wind, grows thickly over the whole churchyard. Here and there a grave has a sort of monument, a block of half-decayed wood, rudely cut in the shape of a coffin. The blocks are brought from the forest of West Jutland, but the forest is the sea itself, and the inhabitants find beams and planks and fragments which the waves have cast upon the beach. One of these blocks had been placed by loving hands on a child's grave, and one of the women who had come out of the church walked up to it. She stood there, her eyes resting on the weather-beaten memorial, and a few moments afterwards her husband joined her. They were both silent, but he took her hand, and they walked together across the purple heath, over moor and meadow, towards the sandhills. For a long time they went on without speaking. "It was a good sermon today," the man said at last. "If we had not God to trust in, we should have nothing." "Yes," replied the woman, "He sends joy and sorrow, and He has a right to send them. Tomorrow our little son would have been 5 years old if we had been permitted to keep him." "It is no use fretting, wife," said the man. "The boy is well provided for. He is where we hope and pray to go to." They said nothing more, but went out towards their houses among the sandhills. All at once, in front of one of the houses, where the sea-grass did not keep the sand down with its twining roots, what seemed to be a column of smoke rose up. A gust of wind rushed between the hills, hurling the particles of sand high into the air. Another gust, and the strings of fish hung up to dry flapped and beat violently against the walls of the cottage. Then everything was quiet once more, and the sun shone with renewed heat. The man and his wife went into the cottage. They had soon taken off their Sunday clothes and come out again. Hurrying over the dunes, which stood there like great waves of sand suddenly arrested in their course, while the sandweeds and dune grass with its bluish stalks spread a changing colour over them. A few neighbours also came out, and helped each other to draw the boats higher up on the beach. The wind now blew more keenly, it was chilly and cold, and when they went back over the sandhills, sand and little sharp stones blew into their faces. The waves rose high, crested with white foam, and the wind cut off their crests, scattering the foam far and wide. Evening came. There was a swelling roar in the air, a wailing or moaning like the voices of despairing spirits that sounded above the thunder of the waves. The fisherman's little cottage was on the very margin, and the sand rattled against the window panes. Every now and then a violent gust of wind shook the house to its foundation. It was dark, but about midnight the moon would rise. Later on the air became clearer, but the storm swept over the perturbed sea with undiminished fury. The fisher folks had long since gone to bed, but in such weather there was no chance of closing an eye. Presently there was a tapping at the window. The door was opened, and a voice said, "There's a large ship stranded on the farthest reef." In a moment the fisher people sprung from their beds and hastily dressed themselves. The moon had risen, and it was light enough to make the surrounding objects visible to those who could open their eyes in the blinding clouds of sand. The violence of the wind was terrible, and it was only possible to pass among the sandhills if one crept forward between the gusts. The salt spray flew up from the sea like down, and the ocean foamed like a roaring cataract towards the beach. Only a practised eye could discern the vessel out in the offing. She was a fine brig, and the waves now lifted her over the reef 3 or 4 cables' length out of the usual channel. She drove towards the shore, struck on the second reef, and remained fixed. It was impossible to render resistance. The sea rushed in upon the vessel, making a clean breach over her. Those on shore thought they heard cries for help from those on board, and could plainly distinguish the busy but useless efforts made by the stranded sailors. Now a wave came rolling onward. It fell with enormous force on the bowsprit, tearing it from the vessel, and the stern was lifted high above the water. Two people were seen to embrace and plunge together into the sea, and the next moment one of the largest waves that rolled towards the sandhills threw a body on the beach. It was a woman. The sailors said that she was quite dead, but the women thought they saw signs of life in her, so the stranger was carried across the sandhills to the fisherman's cottage. How beautiful and fair she was! She must be a great lady, they said. They laid her upon the humble bed. There was not a yard of linen on it, only a woolen coverlet to keep the occupant warm. Life returned to her, but she was delirious, and knew nothing of what had happened or where she was. And it was better so, for everything she loved and valued lay buried in the sea. The same thing happened to her ship as to the one spoken of in the song about the King of England's son. Alas, how terrible to see the gallant bark sink rapidly. Fragments of the wreck and pieces of wood were washed ashore. They were all that remained of the vessel. The wind still blew violently on the coast. For a few moments the strange lady seemed to rest, but she awoke in pain and uttered cries of anguish and fear. She opened her wonderfully beautiful eyes and spoke a few words, but nobody understood her. And lo! As a reward for the sorrow and suffering she had undergone, she held in her arms a new-born babe, the child that was to have rested upon a magnificent couch, draped with silken curtains, in a luxurious home. It was to have been welcomed with joy to a life rich in all the good things of this world. And now heaven had ordained that it should be born in this humble retreat, that it should not even receive a kiss from its mother. For when the fisherman's wife laid the child upon the mother's bosom, it rested on a heart that beat no more. She was dead. The child that was to have been reared amid wealth and luxury was cast into the world, washed by the sea among the sandhills to share the fate and hardships of the poor. Here we are reminded again of the song about the King of England's son, for in it mention is made of the custom prevalent at the time, when knights and squires plundered those who had been saved from shipwreck. The ship had stranded some distance south of Nissim Bay, and the cruel, inhuman days when, as we have just said, the inhabitants of Jutland treated the shipwrecked people so crudely were past long ago. Affectionate sympathy and self-sacrifice for the unfortunate existed then, just as it does in our own time in many a bright example. The dying mother and the unfortunate child would have found kindness and help wherever they had been cast by the winds, but nowhere would it have been more sincere than in the cottage of the poor fisherman's wife, who had stood only the day before beside her child's grave, who would have been 5 years old that day if God had spared it to her. No one knew who the dead stranger was. They could not even form a conjecture. The fragments of wreckage gave no clue to the matter. No tidings reached Spain of the fate of the daughter and son-in-law. They did not arrive at their destination, and violent storms had raged during the past weeks. At last the verdict was given. Foundered at sea, all lost. But in the fisherman's cottage among the sandhills near Hunsby, there lived a little scion of the rich Spanish family. Where heaven sends food for two, a third can manage to find a meal, and in the depth of the sea there is many a dish of fish for the hungry. They called the boy Jürgen. It must certainly be a Jewish child. Its skin is so dark, the people said. It might be an Italian or a Spaniard, remarked the clergyman. But to the fisherman's wife these nations seemed all the same, and she consoled herself with the thought that the child was baptized as a Christian. The boy throve, the noble blood in his veins was warm, and he became strong on his homely fare. He grew apace in the humble cottage, and the Danish dialect spoken by the West Jutes became his language. The pomegranate seed from Spain became a hardy plant on the coast of West Jutland. Thus may circumstances alter the course of a man's life. To this home he clung with deep-rooted affection. He was to experience cold and hunger and the misfortunes and hardships that surround the poor, but he also tasted of their joys. Childhood has bright days for everyone, and the memory of them shines through the whole afterlife. The boy had many sources of pleasure and enjoyment. The coast for miles and miles was full of playthings, for it was a mosaic of pebbles, some red as coral or yellow as amber, and others again white and rounded like birds' eggs, and smoothed and repaired by the sea. Even the bleached fish's skeletons, the water plants dried by the wind, and seaweed, white and shining long linen-like bands waving between the stones. All these seemed made to give pleasure and occupation for the boy's thoughts, and he had an intelligent mind. Many great talents lay dormant in him. How readily he remembered stories and songs that he heard, and how dexterous he was with his fingers. With stones and mussel shells he could put together pictures and ships with which one could decorate the room. And he could make wonderful things from a stick, his foster mother said. Although he was still so young and little, he had a sweet voice, and every melody seemed to flow naturally from his lips. And in his heart were hidden chords, which might have sounded far out into the world if he had been placed anywhere else than in the fisherman's hut by the North Sea. One day another ship was wrecked on the coast, and among other things a chest filled with valuable flower bulbs was washed ashore. Some were put into saucepans and cooked, for they were thought to be fit to eat, and others lay and shriveled in the sand. They did not accomplish their purpose or unfold their magnificent colours. Would Jürgen fare better? The flower bulbs had soon played their part, but he had years of apprenticeship before him. Neither he nor his friends noticed in what a monotonous, uniform way one day followed another, for there was always plenty to do and see. The ocean itself was a great lesson book, and it unfolded a new leaf each day of calm or storm, the crested wave or the smooth surface. The visits to the church were festive occasions, but among the fisherman's house one was especially looked forward to. This was, in fact, the visit of the brother of Jürgen's foster mother, the eel breeder from Fjaltring near Bovjerg. He came twice a year in a cart, painted red with blue and white tulips upon it, and full of eels. It was covered and locked like a box. 2 dun oxen drew it, and Jürgen was allowed to guide them. The eel breeder was a witty fellow, a merry guest, and brought a measure of brandy with him. They all received a small glassful or a cupful if there were not enough glasses. Even Jürgen had about a thimbleful that he might digest the fat eel. As the eel breeder said, he always told one story over and over again, and if his hearers laughed, he would immediately repeat it to them. Jürgen, while still a boy, and also when he was older, used phrases from the eel breeder's story on various occasions, so it will be as well for us to listen to it. It runs thus. The eels went into the bay, and the young ones begged leave to go a little farther out. "Don't go too far," said their mother. "The ugly eel-spearer might come and snap you all up." But they went too far, and of 8 daughters only 3 came back to the mother, and these wept and said, "We only went a little way out." And the ugly eel-spearer came immediately and stabbed 5 of our sisters to death. "They'll come back again," said the mother eel. "Oh, no!" exclaimed the daughters, for he skinned them, cut them in 2, and fried them. "Oh, they'll come back again," the mother eel persisted. "No," replied the daughters, for he ate them up. "They'll come back again," repeated the mother eel. But he drank brandy after them, said the daughters. Then they'll never come back, said the mother, and she burst out crying. It's the brandy that buries the eels. And therefore, said the eel breeder in conclusion, it is always the proper thing to drink brandy after eating eels. This story was the tinsel thread, the most humorous recollection of Jürgen's life. He also wanted to go a little way farther out and up the bay. That is to say, out into the world in a ship. But his mother said, like the eel breeder, there are so many bad people, eel spearers. He wished to go a little way past the sandhills, out into the dunes, and at last he did. 4 happy days, the brightest of his childhood, fell to his lot, and the whole beauty and splendour of Jutland, all the happiness and sunshine of his home, were concentrated in these. He went to a festival, but it was a burial feast. A rich relation of the fisherman's family had died. The farm was situated far eastward in the country, and a little towards the north. Jürgen's foster parents went there, and he also went with them from the dunes, over heath and moor, where the Skjærumaya takes its course through green meadows and contains many eels. Mother eels live there with their daughters, who are caught and eaten up by wicked people. But do not men sometimes act quite as cruelly towards their own fellow men? Was not the knight Sir Bugge murdered by wicked people? And though he was well spoken of, did he not also wish to kill the architect who built the castle for him, with its thick walls and tower, at the point where the Skjærumaya falls into the bay? Jürgen and his parents now stood there. The wall and the ramparts still remained, and red, crumbling fragments lay scattered around. Here it was that Sir Bugge, after the architect had left him, said to one of his men, "Go after him and say, 'Master, the tower shakes. If he turns round, kill him and take away the money I paid him, but if he does not turn round, let him go in peace.'" The man did as he was told. The architect did not turn round, but called back, "The tower does not shake in the least, but one day a man will come from the west in a blue cloak. He will cause it to shake." And so indeed it happened 100 years later, for the North Sea broke in and cast down the tower. But Pred Bjorn Guildenstjerne, the man who then possessed the castle, built a new castle higher up at the end of the meadow, and that one is standing to this day and is called Norre Vosborg. Jürgen and his foster parents went past this castle. They had told him its story during the long winter evenings, and now he saw the stately edifice with its double moat, and trees and bushes. The wall, covered with ferns, rose within the moat, but the lofty lime trees were the most beautiful of all. They grew up to the highest windows, and the air was full of their sweet fragrance. In a northwest corner of the garden stood a great bush full of blossom, like winter snow amid the summer's green. It was a juniper bush, the first that Jürgen had ever seen in bloom. He never forgot it, nor the lime trees. The child's soul treasured up these memories of beauty and fragrance to gladden the old man. From Norra Vosborg, where the juniper blossomed, the journey became more pleasant, for they met some other people who were also going to the funeral and were riding in wagons. Our travellers had to sit all together on a little box at the back of the wagon, but even this, they thought, was better than walking. So they continued their journey across the rugged heath. The oxen which drew the wagon stopped every now and then, where a patch of fresh grass appeared amid the heather. The sun shone with considerable heat, and it was wonderful to behold how in the far distance something like smoke seemed to be rising. Yet this smoke was clearer than the air. It was transparent, and looked like rays of light rolling and dancing afar over the heath. "That is Lokman driving his sheep," said someone, and this was enough to excite Jürgen's imagination. He felt as if they were now about to enter fairyland, though everything was still real. How quiet it was! The heath stretched far and wide around them, like a beautiful carpet. The heather was in blossom, and the juniper bushes and fresh oak saplings rose like bouquets from the earth, an inviting place for a frolic, if it had not been for the number of poisonous adders of which the travellers spoke. They also mentioned that the place had formerly been infested with wolves, and that the district was still called Wolfsburg for this reason. The old man who was driving the oxen told them that in the lifetime of his father the horses had many a hard battle with the wild beasts that were now exterminated. One morning, when he himself had gone out to bring in the horses, he found one of them standing with its forefeet on a wolf it had killed. But the savage animal had torn and lacerated the brave horse's legs. The journey over the heath and the deep sand was only too quickly at an end. They stopped before the house of mourning, where they found plenty of guests within and without. Wagon after wagon stood side by side, while the horses and oxen had been turned out to graze on the scanty pasture. Great sand hills like those at home by the North Sea rose behind the house and extended far and wide. How had they come here, so many miles inland? They were as large and high as those on the coast, and the wind had carried them there. There was also a legend attached to them. Psalms were sung, and a few of the old people shed tears. With this exception, the guests were cheerful enough, it seemed to Jurgen, and there was plenty to eat and drink. There were eels of the fattest, requiring brandy to bury them, as the eel breeder said, and certainly they did not forget to carry out his maxim here. Jurgen went in and out the house, and on the third day he felt as much at home as he did in the fisherman's cottage among the sand hills, where he had passed his early days. Here on the heath were riches unknown to him until now, for flowers, blackberries, and bilberries were to be found in profusion, so large and sweet that when they were crushed beneath the tread of passers-by, the heather was stained with their red juice. Here was a barrow, and yonder another. Then columns of smoke rose into the still air. It was a heath fire, they told him. How brightly it blazed in the dark evening. The fourth day came, and the funeral festivities were at an end. They were to go back from the land dunes to the sand dunes. "Ours are better," said the old fisherman, Jurgen's foster-father. Ye's have no strength." And they spoke of the way in which the sand dunes had come inland, and it seemed very easy to understand. This is how they explained it. A dead body had been found on the coast, and the peasants buried it in the churchyard. From that time the sand began to fly about, and the sea broke in with violence. A wise man in the district advised them to open the grave and see if the buried man was not lying sucking his thumb, for if so, he must be a sailor, and the sea would not rest until it had got him back. The grave was opened, and he really was found with his thumb in his mouth. So they laid him upon a cart and harnessed 2 oxen to it, and the oxen ran off with the sailor over heath and moor to the ocean, as if they had been stung by an adder. Then the sand ceased to fly inland, but the hills that had been piled up still remained. All this Jurgen listened to and treasured up in his memory of the happiest days of his childhood, the days of the burial feast. How delightful it was to see fresh places and to mix with strangers. And he was to go still farther, for he was not yet 14 years old when he went out in a ship to see the world. He encountered bad weather, heavy seas, unkindness, and hard men. Such were his experiences, for he became ship-boy. Cold nights, bad living, and blows had to be endured. Then he felt his noble Spanish blood boil within him, and bitter, angry words rose to his lips, but he gulped them down. It was better, although he felt as the eel must feel when it is skinned, cut up, and put into the frying pan. "I shall get over it," said a voice within him. He saw the Spanish coast, the native land of his parents. He even saw the town where they had lived in joy and prosperity. But he knew nothing of his home or his relations, and his relations knew just as little about him. The poor shipboy was not permitted to land, but on the last day of their stay he managed to get ashore. There were several purchases to be made, and he was sent to carry them on board. Jürgen stood there in his shabby clothes, which looked as if they had been washed in the ditch and dried in the chimney. He, who had always dwelt among the sand hills, now saw a great city for the first time. How lofty the houses seemed, and what a number of people there were in the streets. Some pushing this way, some that. A perfect maelstrom of citizens and peasants, monks and soldiers. The jingling of bells on the trappings of asses and mules, the chiming of church bells, calling, shouting, hammering and knocking, all going on at once. Every trade was located in the basement of the houses or in the side thoroughfares, and the sun shone with such heat, and the air was so close, that one seemed to be in an oven full of beetles, cockchafers, bees and flies, all humming and buzzing together. Jürgen scarcely knew where he was or which way he went. Then he saw just in front of him the great doorway of a cathedral. The lights were gleaming in the dark aisles, and the fragrance of incense was wafted towards him. Even the poorest beggar ventured up the steps into the sanctuary. Jürgen followed the sailor he was with into the church and stood in the sacred edifice. Coloured pictures gleamed from their golden background, and on the altar stood the figure of the Virgin with the child. Jesus, surrounded by lights and flowers, priests in festive robes were chanting, and choir boys in dazzling attire swung silver censers. What splendour and magnificence he saw there! It streamed in upon his soul and overpowered him. The church and the faith of his parents surrounded him, and touched a chord in his heart that caused his eyes to overflow with tears. They went from the church to the marketplace. Here, a quantity of provisions were given him to carry. The way to the harbour was long and weary and overcome with various emotions. He rested for a few moments before a splendid house with marble pillars, statues, and broad steps. Here he rested his burden against the wall. Then a porter in livery came out, lifted up a silver-headed cane, and drove him away the grandson of that house. But no one knew that, and he just as little as anyone. Then he went on board again, and once more encountered rough words and blows, much work and little sleep. Such was his experience of life. They say it is good to suffer in one's young days, if age brings something to make up for it. His period of service on board the ship came to an end, and the vessel lay once more at Rinkjobing in Jutland. He came ashore and went home to the sand dunes near Hunsby, but his foster mother had died during his absence. A hard winter followed this summer. Snowstorms swept over land and sea, and there was difficulty in getting from one place to another. How unequally things are distributed in this world! Here there was bitter cold and snowstorms, while in Spain there was burning sunshine and oppressive heat. Yet, when a clear frosty day came, and Jürgen saw the swans flying in numbers from the sea towards the land, across to Norway, Vosborg, it seemed to him that people could breathe more freely here. The summer also in this part of the world was splendid. In imagination he saw the heath blossom and become purple with rich, juicy berries, and the elder bushes and lime trees at Norvosborg in flower. He made up his mind to go there again. Spring came, and the fishing began. Jürgen was now an active helper in this, for he had grown during the last year and was quick at work. He was full of life and knew how to swim, to tread water, and to turn over and tumble in the strong tide. They often warned him to beware of the sharks, which seize the best swimmer, draw him down, and devour him. But such was not to be Jürgen's fate. At a neighbour's house in the dunes there was a boy named Martin, with whom Jürgen was on very friendly terms, and they both took service in the same ship to Norway and also went together to Holland. They never had a quarrel, but a person can be easily excited to quarrel when he is naturally hot-tempered, for he often shows it in many ways. And this is just what Jürgen did one day when they fell out about the merest trifle. They were sitting behind the cabin door, eating from a Delft plate which they had placed between them. Jürgen held his pocket-knife in his hand and raised it towards Martin, and at the same time became ashy pale, and his eyes had an ugly look. Martin only said, "Ah, you are one of that sort, are you? Fond of using the knife." The words were scarcely spoken when Jürgen's hand sank down. He did not answer a syllable, but went on eating, and afterwards returned to his work. When they were resting again, he walked up to Martin and said, "Hit me in the face. I deserve it. But sometimes I feel as if I had a pot in me that boils over." "There, let the thing rest," replied Martin. And after that they were almost better friends than ever. When afterwards they returned to the dunes and began telling their adventures, this was told among the rest. Martin said that Jürgen was certainly passionate, but a good fellow after all. They were both young and healthy, well-grown and strong, but Jürgen was the cleverer of the two. In Norway, the peasants go into the mountains and take the cattle there to find pasture. On the west coast of Jutland, huts have been erected among the sandhills. They are built of pieces of wreck and thatched with turf and heather. There are sleeping places round the walls, and here the fishermen live and sleep during the early spring. Every fisherman has a female helper, or manager as she is called, who baits his hooks, prepares warm beer for him when he comes ashore, and gets the dinner cooked and ready for him by the time he comes back to the hut, tired and hungry. Besides this, the managers bring out the fish from the boats, cut them open, prepare them, and have generally a great deal to do. Jürgen, his father, and several other fishermen and their managers inhabited the same hut. Martin lived in the next one. One of the girls, whose name was Else, had known Jürgen from childhood. They were glad to see each other, and were of the same opinion on many points, but in appearance they were entirely opposite, for he was dark, and she was pale and fair, and had flaxen hair, and eyes as blue as the sea in sunshine. As they were walking together one day, Jürgen held her hand very firmly in his, and she said to him, "Jürgen, I have something I want to say to you. Let me be your manager, for you are like a brother to me. But Martin, whose housekeeper I am, he is my lover, but you need not tell this to the others." It seemed to Jürgen as if the loose sand was giving way under his feet. He did not speak a word, but nodded his head, and that meant yes. It was all that was necessary, but he suddenly felt in his heart that he hated Martin. And the more he thought, the more he felt convinced that Martin had stolen away from him the only being he ever loved, and that this was Else. He had never thought of Else in this way before, but now it all became plain to him. When the sea is rather rough, and the fishermen are coming home in their great boats, it is wonderful to see how they cross the reefs. One of them stands upright in the bow of the boat, and the others watch him sitting with the oars in their hands. Outside the reef, it looks as if the boat was not approaching land, but going back to sea. Then the man who is standing up gives them the signal that the great wave is coming, which is to float them across the reef. The boat is lifted high into the air, so that the keel is seen from the shore. The next moment nothing can be seen. Mast, keel, and people are all hidden. It seems as though the sea had devoured them. But in a few moments they emerge like a great sea animal climbing up the waves. and the oars move as if the creature had legs. The second and third reef are passed in the same manner. Then the fishermen jump into the water and push the boat towards the shore. Every wave helps them, and at length they have it drawn up beyond the reach of the breakers. A wrong order given in front of the reef, the slightest hesitation, and the boat would be lost. Then it would be all over with me and Martin too. This thought passed through Jürgen's mind one day while they were out at sea, where his foster father had been taken suddenly ill. The fever had seized him. They were only a few oars' strokes from the reef, and Jürgen sprang from his seat and stood up in the bow. "Father, let me come," he said, and he glanced at Martin and across the waves, every oar bent with the exertions of the rowers as the great wave came towards them. And he saw his father's pale face, and dared not obey the evil impulse that had shot through his brain. The boat came safely across the reef to land, but the evil thought remained in his heart, and roused up every little fibre of bitterness which he remembered between himself and Martin since they had known each other. But he could not weave the fibres together, nor did he endeavour to do so. He felt that Martin had robbed him, and this was enough to make him hate his former friend. Several of the fishermen saw this, but Martin did not. He remained as obliging and talkative as ever. In fact, he talked rather too much. Jürgen's foster father took to his bed, and it became his deathbed. For he died a week afterwards, and now Jürgen was heir to the little house behind the sandhills. It was small, certainly, but still it was something, and Martin had nothing of the kind. "You will not go to sea again, Jürgen, I suppose," observed one of the old fishermen. "You will always stay with us now." But this was not Jürgen's intention. He wanted to see something of the world. The eel breeder of Schaltring had an uncle at Old Stegen, who was a fisherman, but also a prosperous merchant with ships upon the sea. He was said to be a good old man, and it would not be a bad thing to enter his service. Old Skagen lies in the extreme north of Jutland, as far away from the Hunsby Dunes as one can travel in that country, and this is just what pleased Jürgen, for he did not want to remain till the wedding of Martin and Else, which would take place in a week or two. The old fisherman said it was foolish to go away, for now that Jürgen had a home, Else would very likely be inclined to take him instead of Martin. Jürgen gave such a vague answer that it was not easy to make out what he meant. The old man brought Else to him, and she said, "You have a home now. You ought to think of that." And Jürgen thought of many things. The sea has heavy waves, but there are heavier waves in the human heart. Many thoughts, strong and weak, rushed through Jürgen's brain, and he said to Else, "If Martin had a house like mine, which of us would you rather have? But Martin has no house and cannot get one. Suppose he had one? Well, then I would certainly take Martin, for that is what my heart tells me, but one cannot live upon love." Jürgen turned these things over in his mind all night. Something was working within him. He hardly knew what it was, but it was even stronger than his love for Else. And so he went to Martin's, and what he said and did there was well considered. He let the house to Martin on most liberal terms, saying that he wished to go to sea again because he loved it. And Else kissed him when she heard of it, for she loved Martin best. Jürgen proposed to start early in the morning, and on the evening before his departure, when it was already getting rather late, he felt a wish to visit Martin once more. He started, and among the dunes met the old fisherman, who was angry at his leaving the place. The old man made jokes about Martin, and declared there must be some magic about that fellow, of whom the girls were so fond. Jürgen did not pay any attention to his remarks, but said good-bye to the old man and went on towards the house where Martin dwelt. He heard loud talking inside. Martin was not alone, and this made Jürgen waver in his determination, for he did not wish to see Else again. On second thoughts, he decided that it was better not to hear any more thanks from Martin, and so he turned back. On the following morning, before the sun rose, he fastened his knapsack on his back, took his wooden provision box in his hand, and went away among the sand hills towards the coast path. This way was more pleasant than the heavy sand road, and besides it was shorter, and he intended to go first to Shoutring, near Bovbjerg, where the eel breeder lived, to whom he had promised a visit. The sea lay before him, clear and blue, and the mussel shells and pebbles, the playthings of his childhood, crunched over his feet. While he thus walked, on his nose suddenly began to bleed. It was a trifling occurrence, but trifles sometimes are of great importance. A few large drops of blood fell upon one of his sleeves. He wiped them off and stopped the bleeding, and it seemed to him as if this had cleared and lightened his brain. The sea kale bloomed here and there in the sand as he passed. He broke off a spray and stuck it in his hat. He determined to be merry and light-hearted, for he was going out into the wide world. A little way out, beyond the bay, as the young eels had said, "Beware of bad people who will catch you and skin you and put you in the frying pan," he repeated in his mind, and smiled, for he thought he should find his way through the world. Good courage is a strong weapon. The sun was high in the heavens when he approached the narrow entrance to Nissum Bay. He looked back and saw a couple of horsemen galloping a long distance behind him, and there were other people with them. But this did not concern him. The ferryboat was on the opposite side of the bay. Jürgen called to the ferryman, and the latter came over with his boat. Jürgen stepped in, but before he had got halfway across, the men whom he had seen riding so hastily came up, hailed the ferryman, and commanded him to return in the name of the law. Jürgen did not understand the reason of this, but he thought it would be best to turn back, and therefore he himself took an oar and returned. As soon as the boat touched the shore, the men sprang on board, and before he was aware of it, they had bound his hands with a rope. "This wicked deed will cost you your life," they said. "It is a good thing we have caught you." He was accused of nothing less than murder. Martin had been found dead, with his throat cut. One of the fishermen, late on the previous evening, had met Jürgen going towards Martin's house. This was not the first time Jürgen had raised his knife against Martin, so they felt sure that he was the murderer. The prison was in a town at a great distance, and the wind was contrary for going there by sea, but it would not take half an hour to get across the bay, and another quarter of an hour would bring them to Nor, Vosborg, the great castle with ramparts and moat. One of Jürgen's captors was a fisherman, a brother of the keeper of the castle, and he said it might be managed that Jürgen should be placed for the present in the dungeon at Losborg, where Long Martha the gypsy had been shut up till her execution. They paid no attention to Jürgen's defence. The few drops of blood on his shirt sleeve bore heavy witness against him. But he was conscious of his innocence, and as there was no chance of clearing himself at present, he submitted to his fate. The party landed just at the place where Sir Buggy's castle had stood, and where Jürgen had walked with his foster parents after the burial feast during the 4 happiest days of his childhood. He was led by the well-known path over the meadow to Vosborg. Once more the elders were in bloom, and the lofty lime trees gave forth sweet fragrance, and it seemed as if it were but yesterday that he had last seen the spot. In each of the 2 wings of the castle there was a staircase which led to a place below the entrance, from whence there is access to a low, vaulted cellar. In this dungeon Long Martha had been imprisoned, and from here she was led away to the scaffold. She had eaten the hearts of 5 children, and had imagined that if she could obtain 2 more, she would be able to fly and make herself invisible. In the middle of the roof of the cellar there was a little narrow air-hole, but no window. The flowering lime trees could not breathe refreshing fragrance into that abode, where everything was dark and mouldy. There was only a rough bench in the cell, but a good conscience is a soft pillow, and therefore Jürgen could sleep well. The thick oaken door was locked and secured on the outside by an iron bar, but the goblin of superstition can creep through a keyhole into a baron's castle just as easily as it can into a fisherman's cottage. And why should he not creep in here, where Jürgen sat, thinking of Long Martha and her wicked deeds? Her last thoughts on the night before her execution had filled this place, and the magic that tradition asserted to have been practiced here, in Sir Svanwidel's time, came into Jürgen's mind and made him shudder. But a sunbeam, a refreshing thought from without, penetrated his heart even here. It was the remembrance of the flowering elder and the sweet-smelling lime trees. He was not left there long. They took him away to the town of Ringjobbing, where he was imprisoned with equal severity. Those times were not like ours. The common people were treated harshly, and it was just after the days when farms were converted into knights, estates, when coachmen and servants were often made magistrates and had power to sentence a poor man for a small offence to lose his property and to corporeal punishment. Judges of this kind were still to be found, and in Jutland, so far from the capital and from the enlightened, well-meaning head of the government, the law was still very loosely administered sometimes. The smallest grievance Jürgen could expect was that his case should be delayed. His dwelling was cold and comfortless, and how long would he be obliged to bear all this? It seemed his fate to suffer misfortune and sorrow innocently. He now had plenty of time to reflect on the difference of fortune on earth, and to wonder why this fate had been allotted to him. Yet he felt sure that all would be made clear in the next life, the existence that awaits us when this life is over. His faith had grown strong in the poor fisherman's cottage. The light which had never shone into his father's mind, in all the richness and sunshine of Spain, was sent to him to be his comfort in poverty and distress, a sign of that mercy of God which never fails. The spring storms began to blow. The rolling and moaning of the North Sea could be heard for miles inland when the wind was blowing, and then it sounded like the rushing of 1,000 wagons over a hard road with a mine underneath. Jürgen heard these sounds in his prison, and it was a relief to him. No music could have touched his heart, as did these sounds of the sea, the rolling sea, the boundless sea, on which a man can be borne across the world before the wind, carrying his own house with him wherever he goes, just as the snail carries its home even into a strange country. He listened eagerly to its deep murmur, and then the thought arose, "Free! Free! How happy to be free, even barefooted and in ragged clothes!" Sometimes, when such thoughts crossed his mind, the fiery nature rose within him, and he beat the wall with his clenched fists. Weeks, months, a whole year had gone by when Niels the thief, called also a horse-dealer, was arrested, and now better times came, and it was seen that Jürgen had been wrongly accused. On the afternoon before Jürgen's departure from home, and before the murder, Niels the thief had met Martin at a beer-house in the neighbourhood of Ringjobbing. A few glasses were drank, not enough to cloud the brain, but enough to loosen Martin's tongue. He began to boast and to say that he had obtained a house and intended to marry, and when Niels asked him where he was going to get the money, he slapped his pocket proudly and said, "The money is here, where it ought to be." This boast cost him his life, for when he went home, Niels followed him and cut his throat, intending to rob the murdered man of the gold, which did not exist. All this was circumstantially explained, but it is enough for us to know that Jürgen was set free. But what compensation did he get for having been imprisoned a whole year, and shut out from all communication with his fellow creatures? They told him he was fortunate in being proved innocent, and that he might go. The burgomaster gave him $2 for traveling expenses, and many citizens offered him provisions and beer. They were still good people. They were not all hard and pitiless. But the best thing of all was that the merchant Bronn of Skjegen, into whose service Jürgen had proposed entering the year before, was just at that time on business in the town of Rinkjobing. Bronno heard the whole story. He was kind-hearted and understood what Jürgen must have felt and suffered. Therefore, he made up his mind to make it up to the poor lad and convince him that there were still kind folks in the world. So Jürgen went forth from prison as if to paradise, to find freedom, affection, and trust. He was to travel this path now, for no goblet of life is all bitterness. No good man would pour out such a draught for his fellow man, and how should he do it? Who is love personified? "Let everything be buried and forgotten," said Bronny, the merchant. "Let us draw a thick line through last year. We will even burn the almanac. In 2 days we will start for dear, friendly, peaceful Skjegen. People call it an out-of-the-way corner, but it is a good, warm chimney corner, and its windows open toward every part of the world." What a journey that was! It was like taking fresh breath out of the cold dungeon air into the warm sunshine. The heather bloomed in pride and beauty, and the shepherd boy sat on a barrow and blew his pipe, which he had carved for himself out of a sheep bone. Fata Morgana, the beautiful aerial phenomenon of the wilderness, appeared with hanging gardens and waving forests, and the wonderful cloud called Lokwen driving his sheep also was seen. Up towards Skjegen they went, through the land of the Wendels, whence the men with long beards, the Longobardi, or Lombards, had emigrated in the reign of King Sneo, when all the children and old people were to have been killed, till the noble Dame Gambaruk proposed that the young people should emigrate. Jürgen knew all this. He had some little knowledge, and although he did not know the land of the Lombards beyond the lofty Alps, he had an idea that it must be there. For in his boyhood he had been in the south, in Spain. He thought of the plenteousness of the southern fruit, of the red pomegranate flowers, of the humming, buzzing, and toiling in the great beehive of a city he had seen. But home is the best place after all, and Jürgen's home was Denmark. At last they arrived at Vendilskaga, as Skjegen is called in old Norwegian and Icelandic writings. At that time, old Skjegen, with the eastern and western town, extended for miles, with sand hills and arable land as far as the lighthouse near Drennen. Then, as now, the houses were strewn among the wind-raised sand hills. A wilderness in which the wind sports with the sand, and where the voice of the seagull and wild swan strikes harshly on the ear. In the southwest, a mile from Drennen, lies Old Skjegen. Merchant Bronn dwelt here, and this was also to be Jürgen's home for the future. The dwelling house was tarred, and all the small outbuildings had been put together from pieces of wreck. There was no fence, for indeed there was nothing to fence in except the long rows of fishes which were hung upon lines, one above the other, to dry in the wind. The entire coast was strewn with spoiled herrings, for there were so many of these fish that a net was scarcely thrown into the sea before it was filled. They were caught by carloads, and many of them were either thrown back into the sea or left to lie on the beach. The old man's wife and daughter and his servants also came to meet him with great rejoicing. There was a great squeezing of hands and talking and questioning. And the daughter, what a sweet face and bright eyes she had! The inside of the house was comfortable and roomy. Fritters, that a king would have looked upon as a dainty dish, were placed on the table, and there was wine from the Skjegen vineyard, that is the sea, for there the grapes come ashore ready pressed and prepared in barrels and in bottles. When the mother and daughter heard who Jürgen was, and how innocently he had suffered, they looked at him in a still more friendly way, and pretty Clara's eyes had a look of especial interest as she listened to his story. Jürgen found a happy home in old Stegen. It did his heart good, for it had been sorely tried. He had drunk the bitter goblet of love, which softens or hardens the heart according to circumstances. Jürgen's heart was still soft. It was young, and therefore it was a good thing that Miss Clara was going in 3 weeks' time to Kristiansand in Norway, in her father's ship, to visit an aunt and to stay there the whole winter. On the Sunday before she went away, they all went to church, to the Holy Communion. The church was large and handsome, and had been built centuries before by Scotchmen and Dutchmen. It stood some little way out of the town. It was rather ruinous, certainly, and the road to it was heavy, through deep sand. But the people gladly surmounted these difficulties to get to the house of God, to sing psalms and to hear the sermon. The sand had heaped itself up round the walls of the church, but the graves were kept free from it. It was the largest church north of the Limfjorden, the Virgin Mary, with a golden crown on her head, and the child. Jesus in her arms stood lifelike on the altar. The holy apostles had been carved in the choir, and on the walls there were portraits of the old burgomasters and councillors of Skegen. The pulpit was of carved work. The sun shone brightly into the church, and its radiance fell on the polished brass chandelier and on the little ship that hung from the vaulted roof. Jürgen felt overcome by a holy, childlike feeling, like that which possessed him when, as a boy, he stood in the splendid Spanish cathedral. But here the feeling was different, for he felt conscious of being one of the congregation. After the sermon followed Holy Communion. He partook of the bread and wine, and it so happened that he knelt by the side of Miss Clara. But his thoughts were so fixed upon heaven and the Holy Sacrament that he did not notice his neighbour until he rose from his knees. And then he saw tears rolling down her cheeks. She left Skjagen and went to Norway 2 days later. He remained behind and made himself useful on the farm and at the fishery. He went out fishing, and in those days fish were more plentiful and larger than they are now. The shoals of the mackerel glittered in the dark nights and indicated where they were swimming. The gurnards snarled, and the crabs gave forth pitiful yells when they were chased. For fish are not so mute as people say. Every Sunday Jürgen went to church, and when his eyes rested on the picture of the Virgin Mary over the altar as he sat there, they often glided away to the spot where they had knelt side by side. Autumn came, and brought rain and snow with it. The water rose up right into the town of Skegen. The sand could not suck it all in. One had to wade through it or go by boat. The storms threw vessel after vessel on the fatal reefs. There were snowstorm and sand storms. The sand flew up to the houses, blocking the entrances, so that people had to creep up through the chimneys. That was nothing at all remarkable here. It was pleasant and cheerful indoors, where peat fuel and fragments of wood from the wrecks blazed and crackled upon the hearth. Merchant Bron read aloud from an old chronicle about Prince Hamlet of Denmark, who had come over from England, landed near Bovjörg, and fought a battle. Close by, Rama was his grave, only a few miles from the place where the eel breeder lived. Hundreds of barrow rose there from the heath, forming, as it were, an enormous churchyard. Merchant Bron had himself been at Hamlet's grave. They spoke about old times and about their neighbours, the English and the Scotch, and Jürgen sang the air of "The King of England's Son," and of his splendid ship and its outfit. In the hour of peril when most men fear, he clasped the bride that he held so dear, and proved himself the son of a king. Of his courage and valour let us sing. This verse Jürgen sang with so much feeling that his eyes beamed, and they were black and sparkling since his infancy. There was wealth, comfort, and happiness even among the domestic animals, for they were all well cared for and well kept. The kitchen looked bright with its copper and tin utensils and white plates, and from the rafters hung hams, beef, and winter stores in plenty. This can still be seen in many rich farms on the west coast of Jutland. Plenty to eat and drink, clean, prettily decorated rooms, active minds, cheerful tempers, and hospitality can be found there, as in an Arab's tent. Jürgen had never spent such a happy time since the famous burial feast, and yet Miss Clara was absent, except in the thoughts and memory of all. In April, a ship was to start for Norway, and Jürgen was to sail in it. He was full of life and spirits, and looked so sturdy and well that Dame Bronn said it did her good to see him. "And it does one good to look at you also, old wife," said the merchant. "Jürgen has brought fresh life into our winter evenings, and into you too, mother. You look younger than ever this year, and seem well and cheerful. But then you were once the prettiest girl in Viborg, and that is saying a great deal, for I have always found the Viborg girls the prettiest of any." Jürgen said nothing, but he thought of a certain maiden of Steken, whom he was soon to visit. The ship set sail for Christiansand in Norway, and as the wind was favourable, it soon arrived there. One morning Merchant Bronn went out to the lighthouse, which stands a little way out of Old Stegen, not far from Grennen. The light was out, and the sun was already high in the heavens when he mounted the tower. The sandbanks extend a whole mile from the shore, beneath the water. Outside these banks, many ships could be seen that day, and with the aid of his telescope the old man thought he descried his own ship, the Karen Bronn. Yes! Certainly there she was, sailing homewards with Clara and Jürgen on board. Clara sat on deck and saw the sandhills gradually appearing in the distance. The church and lighthouse looked like a heron and a swan rising from the blue waters. If the wind held good, they might reach home in about an hour. So near they were to home and all its joys, so near to death and all its terrors. A plank in the ship gave way, and the water rushed in. The crew flew to the pumps and did their best to stop the leak. The signal of distress was hoisted, but they were still fully a mile from the shore. Some fishing boats were in sight, but they were too far off to be of any use. The wind blew towards the land. The tide was in their favour, but it was all useless. The ship could not be saved. Jürgen threw his right arm round Clara and pressed her to him. With what a look she gazed up into his face, as with a prayer to God for help. He breasted the waves, which rushed over the sinking ship. She uttered a cry, but she felt safe and certain that he would not leave her to sink. And in this hour of terror and danger, Jürgen felt as the king's son did, as told in the old song. In the hour of peril when most men fear, he clasped the bride that he held so dear. How glad he felt that he was a good swimmer. He worked his way onward with his feet and one arm, while he held the young girl up firmly with the other. He rested on the waves, he trod the water, in fact, did everything he could think of, in order not to fatigue himself and to reserve strength enough to reach land. He heard Clara sigh, and felt her shudder convulsively, and he pressed her more closely to him. Now and then a wave rolled over them. The current lifted them. The water, although deep, was so clear that for a moment he imagined he saw the shoals of mackerel glittering, or Leviathan himself ready to swallow them. Now the clouds cast a shadow over the water. Then again came the playing sunbeams. Flocks of loudly screaming birds passed over him, and the plump and lazy wild ducks, which allow themselves to be drifted by the waves, rose up terrified at the sight of the swimmer. He began to feel his strength decreasing, but he was only a few cable lengths distance from the shore, and help was coming, for a boat was approaching him. At this moment he distinctly saw a white staring figure under the water. A wave lifted him up, and he came nearer to the figure. He felt a violent shock, and everything became dark around him. On the sand reef lay the wreck of a ship which was covered with water at high tide. The white figurehead rested against the anchor, the sharp iron edge of which rose just above the surface. Jürgen had come in contact with this. The tide had driven him against it with great force. He sank down stunned with the blow, but the next wave lifted him and the young girl up again. Some fishermen, coming with a boat, seized them and dragged them into it. The blood streamed down over Jürgen's face. He seemed dead, but still held the young girl so tightly that they were obliged to take her from him by force. She was pale and lifeless. They laid her in the boat and rowed as quickly as possible to the shore. They tried every means to restore Clara to life, but it was all of no avail. Jürgen had been swimming for some distance with a corpse in his arms, and had exhausted his strength for one who was dead. Jürgen still breathed, so the fishermen carried him to the nearest house upon the sand hills, where a smith and general dealer lived who knew something of surgery, and bound up Jürgen's wounds in a temporary way until a surgeon could be obtained from the nearest town the next day. The injured man's brain was affected, and in his delirium he uttered wild cries. But on the third day he lay quiet and weak upon his bed. His life seemed to hang by a thread, and the physician said it would be better for him if this thread broke. "Let us pray that God may take him," he said, "for he will never be the same man again." But life did not depart from him. The thread would not break, but the thread of memory was severed. The thread of his mind had been cut through, and what was still more grievous, a body remained, a living, healthy body that wandered about like a troubled spirit. Jürgen remained in Merchant Braun's house. "He was hurt while endeavoring to save our child," said the old man, "and now he is our son." People called Jürgen insane, but that was not exactly the correct term. He was like an instrument in which the strings are loose and will give no sound. Only occasionally they regained their power for a few minutes, and then they sounded as they used to do. He would sing snatches of songs or old melodies. Pictures of the past would rise before him, and then disappear in the mist, as it were. But as a general rule he sat staring into vacancy, without a thought. We may conjecture that he did not suffer, but his dark eyes lost their brightness and looked like clouded glass. "Poor mad Jürgen," said the people, and this was the end of a life whose infancy was to have been surrounded with wealth and splendor had his parents lived. All his great mental abilities had been lost. Nothing but hardship, sorrow, and disappointment had been his fate. He was like a rare plant, torn from its native soil, and tossed upon the beach to wither there. And was this one of God's creatures, fashioned in his own likeness, to have no better fate? Was he to be only the plaything of fortune? No, the all-loving Creator would certainly repay him in the life to come for what he had suffered and lost here. "The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is over all his works." The pious old wife of the merchant repeated these words from the Psalms of David in patience and hope, and the prayer of her heart was that Jürgen might soon be called away to enter into eternal life. In the churchyard, where the walls were surrounded with sand, Clara lay buried. Jürgen did not seem to know this. It did not enter his mind, which could only retain fragments of the past. Every Sunday he went to church with the old people, and sat there silently staring vacantly before him. One day, when the psalms were being sung, he sighed deeply, and his eyes became bright. They were fixed upon a place near the altar where he had knelt with his friend who was dead. He murmured her name and became deadly pale, and tears rolled down his cheeks. They let him out of church. He told those standing round him that he was well and had never been ill. He, who had been so grievously afflicted, the outcast thrown upon the world, could not remember his sufferings. The Lord our Creator is wise and full of loving kindness. Who can doubt it? In Spain, where balmy breezes blow over the Moorish cupolas and gently stir the orange and myrtle groves, where singing and the sound of the castanets are always heard, the richest merchant in the place, a childless old man, sat in a luxurious house, while children marched in procession through the streets with waving flags and lighted tapers. If he had been able to press his children to his heart, his daughter or her child, that had, perhaps, never seen the light of day, far less the kingdom of heaven, how much of his wealth would he not have given? Poor child! Yes, poor child! A child still, yet more than 30 years old, for Jürgen had arrived at this age in Old Skegen. The shifting sands had covered the graves in the courtyard, quite up to the church walls, but still the dead must be buried among their relatives and the dear ones who had gone before them. Merchant Bronnet and his wife now rested with their children under the white sand. It was in the spring, the season of storms. The sand from the dunes was whirled up in clouds, the sea was rough, and flocks of birds flew like clouds in the storm, screaming across the sand hills. Shipwreck followed upon shipwreck on the reefs between Old Skagen and the Hunsby dunes. One evening Jürgen sat in his room alone. All at once his mind seemed to become clearer, and a restless feeling came over him, such as had often, in his younger days, driven him out to wander over the sand hills or on the heath. "Home, home!" he cried. No one heard him. He went out and walked towards the dunes. Sand and stones blew into his face and whirled round him. He went in the direction of the church. The sand was banked up the walls, half covering the windows, but it had been cleared away in front of the door, and the entrance was free and easy to open, so Jürgen went into the church. The storm raged over the town of Skegen. There had not been such a terrible tempest within the memory of the inhabitants, nor such a rough sea. But Jürgen was in the temple of God, and while the darkness of night reigned outside, a light arose in his soul that was never to depart from it. The heavy weight that pressed on his brain burst asunder. He fancied he heard the organ, but it was only the storm and the moaning of the sea. He sat down on one of the seats, and lo! The candles were lighted one by one, and there was brightness and grandeur such as he had only seen in the Spanish cathedral. The portraits of the old citizens became alive, stepped down from the walls against which they had hung for centuries, and took seats near the church door. The gates flew open, and all the dead people from the churchyard came in and filled the church, while beautiful music sounded. Then the melody of the psalm burst forth, like the sound of the waters, and Jürgen saw that his foster parents from the Hunsby dunes were there, also old merchant Bronn with his wife and their daughter Clara, who gave him her hand. They both went up to the altar where they had knelt before, and the priest joined their hands and united them for life. Then music was heard again. It was wonderfully sweet, like a child's voice, full of joy and expectation, swelling to the powerful tones of a full organ, sometimes soft and sweet, then like the sounds of a tempest, delightful and elevating to hear, yet strong enough to burst the stone tombs of the dead. Then the little ship that hung from the roof of the choir was let down and looked wonderfully large and beautiful, with its silken sails and rigging. The ropes were of silk, the anchor of gold, and everywhere riches and pomp untold, as the old song says. The young couple went on board, accompanied by the whole congregation, for there was room and enjoyment for them all. Then the walls and arches of the church were covered with flowering junipers and lime trees breathing forth fragrance. The branches waved, Creating a pleasant coolness, they bent and parted, and the ship sailed between them through the air and over the sea. Every candle in the church became a star, and the wind sang a hymn in which they all joined. Through love to glory, no life is lost. The future is full of blessings and happiness. Hallelujah! These were the last words Jürgen uttered in this world, for the thread that bound his immortal soul was severed, and nothing but the dead body lay in the dark church, while the storm raged outside, covering it with loose sand. The next day was Sunday, and the congregation and their pastor went to the church. The road had always been heavy, but now it was almost unfit for use, and when they at last arrived at the church, a great heap of sand lay piled up in front of them. The whole church was completely buried in sand. The clergyman offered a short prayer and said that God had closed the door of his house here, and that the congregation must go and build a new one for him somewhere else. So they sung a hymn in the open air and went home again. Jürgen could not be found anywhere in the town of Skagen, nor on the dunes, though they searched for him everywhere. They came to the conclusion that one of the great waves, which had rolled far up on the beach, had carried him away, but his body lay buried in a great sepulchre. The church itself. The Lord had thrown down a covering for his grave during the storm, and the heavy mound of sand lies upon it to this day. The drifting sand had covered the vaulted roof of the church, the arched cloisters, and the stone aisles. The white thorn and the dog rose now blossom above the place where the church lies buried, but the spire, like an enormous monument over a grave, can be seen for miles round. No king has a more splendid memorial. Nothing disturbs the peaceful sleep of the dead. I was the first to hear this story, for the storm sung it to me among the sandhills. A story. In the garden, all the apple trees were in blossom. They had hastened to bring forth flowers before they got green leaves. And in the yard, all the ducklings walked up and down, and the cat too. It basked in the sun and licked the sunshine from its own paws. And when one looked at the fields, how beautifully the corn stood, and how green it shone, without comparison. And there was a twittering and a fluttering of all the little birds, as if the day were a great festival, and so it was, for it was Sunday. All the bells were ringing, and all the people went to church, looking cheerful, and dressed in their best clothes. There was a look of cheerfulness on everything. The day was so warm and beautiful that one might well have said, God's kindness to us men is beyond all limits. But inside the church the pastor stood in the pulpit and spoke very loudly and angrily. He said that all men were wicked, and God would punish them for their sins, and that the wicked, when they died, would be cast into hell, to burn for ever and ever. He spoke very excitedly, saying that their evil propensities would not be destroyed, nor would the fire be extinguished, and they should never find rest. That was terrible to hear, and he said it in such a tone of conviction. He described hell to them as a miserable home where all the refuse of the world gathers. There was no air beside the hot burning sulphur flame, and there was no ground under their feet. They, the wicked ones, sank deeper and deeper, while eternal silence surrounded them. It was dreadful to hear all that, for the preacher spoke from his heart, and all the people in the church were terrified. Meanwhile, the birds sang merrily outside, and the sun was shining so beautifully warm, it seemed as though every little flower said, God, thy kindness towards us all is without limits. Indeed, outside it was not at all like the pastor's sermon. The same evening, upon going to bed, the pastor noticed his wife sitting there quiet and pensive. What is the matter with you? He asked her. Well, the matter with me is, she said, that I cannot collect my thoughts, and am unable to grasp the meaning of what you said today in church, that there are so many wicked people, and that they should burn eternally. Alas, eternally! How long? I am only a woman and a sinner before God, but I should not have the heart to let even the worst sinner burn forever. And how could our Lord to do so, who is so infinitely good, and who knows how the wickedness comes from without and within? No, I am unable to imagine that, although you say so. It was autumn. The trees dropped their leaves. The earnest and severe pastor sat at the bedside of a dying person. A pious, faithful soul closed her eyes forever. She was the pastor's wife. If anyone shall find rest in the grave and mercy before our Lord, you shall certainly do so, said the pastor. He folded her hands and read a psalm over the dead woman. She was buried. 2 large tears rolled over the cheeks of the earnest man, and in the parsonage it was empty and still, for its sun had set forever. She had gone home. It was night. A cold wind swept over the pastor's head. He opened his eyes, and it seemed to him as if the moon was shining into his room. It was not so, however. There was a being standing before his bed, and looking like the ghost of his deceased wife. She fixed her eyes upon him with such a kind and sad expression, just as if she wished to say something to him. The pastor raised himself in bed and stretched his arms towards her, saying, Not even you can find eternal rest. You suffer, you best and most pious woman? The dead woman nodded her head as if to say, Yes, and put her hand on her breast. And can I not obtain rest in the grave for you? Yes, was the answer. And how? Give me 1 hair, only 1 single hair, from the head of the sinner for whom the fire shall never be extinguished, of the sinner whom God will condemn to eternal punishment in hell. Yes, one ought to be able to redeem you so easily, you pure, pious woman, he said. Follow me, said the dead woman. It is thus granted to us. By my side, you will be able to fly wherever your thoughts wish to go. Invisible to men, we shall penetrate into their most secret chambers, but with sure hand you must find out him who is destined to eternal torture, and before the cock crows he must be found. As quickly as if carried by the winged thoughts they were in the great city, and from the walls the names of the deadly sins shone in flaming letters: pride, avarice, drunkenness, wantonness. In short, the whole 7-colored bough of sin. Yes, therein, as I believed, as I knew it, said the pastor, are living those who are abandoned to the eternal fire. And they were standing before the magnificently illuminated gate. The broad steps were adorned with carpets and flowers, and dance music was sounding through the festive halls. A footman dressed in silken velvet stood with a large silver-mounted rod near the entrance. Our ball can compare favourably with the king's, he said, and turned with contempt towards the gazing crowd in the street. What he thought was sufficiently expressed in his features and movements. Miserable beggars who are looking in, you are nothing in comparison to me. Pride, said the dead woman. Do you see him? The footman, asked the pastor. He is but a poor fool, and not doomed to be tortured eternally by fire? Only a fool. It sounded through the whole house of Pride. They were all fools there. Then they flew within the 4 naked walls of the miser. Lean as a skeleton, trembling with cold and hunger, the old man was clinging with all his thoughts to his money. They saw him jump up feverishly from his miserable couch and take a loose stone out of the wall. There lay gold coins in an old stocking. They saw him anxiously feeling over an old ragged coat in which pieces of gold were sewn, and his clammy fingers trembled. He is ill. That is madness, a joyless madness, besieged by fear and dreadful dreams. They quickly went away and came before the beds of the criminals. These unfortunate people slept side by side in long rows. Like a ferocious animal, one of them rose out of his sleep and uttered a horrible cry, and gave his comrade a violent dig in the ribs with his pointed elbow. And this one turned round in his sleep. "Be quiet, monster, sleep. This happens every night." "Every night," repeated the other. "Yes, every night he comes and tortures me. In my violence I have done this and that. I was born with an evil mind, which has brought me hither for the second time. But if I have done wrong, I suffer punishment for it. One thing, however, I have not yet confessed. When I came out a little while ago, and passed by the yard of my former master, evil thoughts rose within me when I remembered this and that. I struck a match a little bit on the wall. Probably it came a little too close to the thatched roof. All burnt down. A great heat rose, such as sometimes overcomes me. I myself helped to rescue cattle and things. Nothing alive burnt, except a flight of pigeons, which flew into the fire. And the yard dog, of which I had not thought, one could hear him howl out of the fire. And this howling I still hear when I wish to sleep, and when I have fallen asleep, the great rough dog comes and places himself upon me, and howls, presses, and tortures me. Now listen to what I tell you. You can snore, you are snoring the whole night, and I hardly a quarter of an hour." And the blood rose to the head of the excited criminal. He threw himself upon his comrade and beat him with his clenched fist in the face. "Wicked Mats has become mad again," they said amongst themselves. The other criminals seized him, wrestled with him, and bent him double, so that his head rested between his knees. And they tied him, so that the blood almost came out of his eyes and out of all his pores. "You are killing the unfortunate man," said the pastor. And as he stretched out his hand to protect him who already suffered too much, the scene changed. They flew through rich halls and wretched hovels, wantonness and envy. All the deadly sins passed before them. An angel of justice read their crimes and their defense. The latter was not a brilliant one, but it was read before God. Who reads the heart? Who knows everything, the wickedness that comes from within and from without? Who is mercy and love personified? The pastor's hand trembled. He dared not stretch it out. He did not venture to pull a hair out of the sinner's head. And tears gushed from his eyes like a stream of mercy and love, the cooling waters of which extinguished the eternal fire of hell. Just then the cock crowed. "Father of all mercy, grant thou to her the peace that I was unable to procure for her." "I have it now," said the dead woman. "It was your hard words, your despair of mankind, your gloomy belief in God and his creation, which drove me to you. Learn to know mankind. Even in the wicked one lives a part of God, and this extinguishes and conquers the flame of hell." The pastor felt a kiss on his lips. A gleam of light surrounded him. God's bright sun shone into the room, and his wife, alive, sweet, and full of love, awoke him from a dream which God had sent him. "Annie!" Lisbeth. Anne Lisbeth was a beautiful young woman, with a red and white complexion, glittering white teeth, and clear soft eyes, and her footstep was light in the dance, but her mind was lighter still. She had a little child, not at all pretty, so he was put out to be nursed by a labourer's wife, and his mother went to the Count's castle. She sat in splendid rooms, richly decorated with silk and velvet. Not a breath of air was allowed to blow upon her, and no one was allowed to speak to her harshly, for she was nurse to the Count's child. He was fair and delicate as a prince, and beautiful as an angel. And how she loved this child! Her own boy was provided for by being at the labourers, where the mouth watered more frequently than the pot boiled, and where in general no one was at home to take care of the child. Then he would cry, "But what nobody knows, nobody cares for." So he would cry till he was tired, and then fall asleep. And while we are asleep, we can feel neither hunger nor thirst. Ah, yes, sleep is a capital invention. As years went on, Anne Lisbeth's child grew apace like weeds, although they said his growth had been stunted. He had become quite a member of the family in which he dwelt. They received money to keep him, so that his mother got rid of him altogether. She had become quite a lady. She had a comfortable home of her own in the town, and out of doors. When she went for a walk, she wore a bonnet. But she never walked out to see the labourer. That was too far from the town, and, indeed, she had nothing to go for. The boy now belonged to these labouring people. He had food, and he could also do something towards earning his living. He took care of Mary's red cow, for he knew how to tend cattle and make himself useful. The great dog, by the yard gate of a nobleman's mansion, sits proudly on the top of his kennel when the sun shines, and barks at every one that passes. But if it rains, he creeps into his house, and there he is, warm and dry. Anne Lisbeth's boy also sat in the sunshine on the top of the fence, cutting out a little toy. If it was springtime, he knew of 3 strawberry plants in blossom, which would certainly bear fruit. This was his most hopeful thought, though it often came to nothing. And he had to sit out in the rain in the worst weather and get wet to the skin, and let the cold wind dry the clothes on his back afterwards. If he went near the farmyard belonging to the Count, he was pushed and knocked about, for the men and the maids said he was so horrible, ugly. But he was used to all this, for nobody loved him. This was how the world treated Anne Lisbeth's boy, and how could it be otherwise? It was his fate to be beloved by no one. Hitherto he had been a land crab. The land at last cast him adrift. He went to sea in a wretched vessel, and sat at the helm, while the skipper sat over the grog can. He was dirty and ugly, half frozen and half starved. He always looked as if he never had enough to eat, which was really the case. Late in the autumn, when the weather was rough, windy, and wet, and the cold penetrated through the thickest clothing, especially at sea, a wretched boat went out to sea with only 2 men on board, or, more correctly, a man and a half, for it was the skipper and his boy. There had only been a kind of twilight all day, and it soon grew quite dark and so bitterly cold that the skipper took a dram to warm him. The bottle was old, and the glass too. It was perfect in the upper part, but the foot was broken off, and it had therefore been fixed upon a little carved block of wood, painted blue. A dram is a great comfort, and 2 are better still, thought the skipper, while the boy sat at the helm, which he held fast in his hard-seamed hands. He was ugly, and his hair was matted, and he looked crippled and stunted. They called him the field labourer's boy, though in the church register he was entered as Anne Lisbeth's son. The wind cut through the rigging, and the boat cut through the sea. The sails, filled by the wind, swelled out and carried them along in wild career. It was wet and rough above and below, and might still be worse. Hold! What is that? What has struck the boat? Was it a waterspout or a heavy sea rolling suddenly upon them? Heaven help us! Cried the boy at the helm, as the boat heeled over and lay on its beam ends. It had struck on a rock, which rose from the depths of the sea and sank at once, like an old shoe in a puddle. It sank at once with mouse and man, as the saying is. There might have been mice on board, but only 1 man and a half, the skipper and the labourer's boy. No one saw it but the skimming seagulls and the fishes beneath the water, and even they did not see it properly, for they darted back with terror as the boat filled with water and sank. There it lay, scarcely a fathom below the surface, and those two were provided for, buried and forgotten. The glass with the foot of blue wood was the only thing that did not sink, for the wood floated and the glass drifted away to be cast upon the shore and broken, where and when is indeed of no consequence. It had served its purpose, and it had been loved, which Anne Lisbeth's boy had not been. But in heaven no soul will be able to say never loved. Anne Lisbeth had now lived in the town many years. She was called Madame, and felt dignified in consequence. She remembered the old, noble days in which she had driven in the carriage, and had associated with Countess and Baroness. Her beautiful, noble child had been a dear angel, and possessed the kindest heart. He had loved her so much, and she had loved him in return. They had kissed and loved each other, and the boy had been her joy, her second life. Now he was 14 years of age, tall, handsome, and clever. She had not seen him since she carried him in her arms. Neither had she been for years to the Count's palace. It was quite a journey thither from the town. "I must make one effort to go," said Anne Lisbeth, "to see my darling, the Count's sweet child, and press him to my heart. Certainly he must long to see me too, the young Count. No doubt he thinks of me and loves me, as in those days when he would fling his angel arms round my neck and lisp, 'Anne Liz.' It was music to my ears. Yes, I must make an effort to see him again." She drove across the country in a grazier's cart, and then got out and continued her journey on foot, and thus reached the Count's castle. It was as great and magnificent as it had always been, and the garden looked the same as ever. All the servants were strangers to her. Not one of them knew Anne Lisbeth, nor of what consequence she had once been there. But she felt sure the Countess would soon let them know it, and her darling boy. Too, how she longed to see him! Now that Anne Lisbeth was at her journey's end, she was kept waiting a long time, and for those who wait, time passes slowly. But before the great people went in to dinner, she was called in and spoken to very graciously. She was to go in again after dinner, and then she would see her sweet boy once more. How tall and slender and thin he had grown! But the eyes and the sweet angel mouth were still beautiful. He looked at her, but he did not speak. He certainly did not know who she was. He turned round and was going away, but she seized his hand and pressed it to her lips. "Well, well," he said, and with that he walked out of the room. He who filled her every thought, he whom she loved best, and who was her whole earthly pride. Anne Lisbeth went forth from the castle into the public road, feeling mournful and sad. He whom she had nursed day and night, and even now carried about in her dreams, had been cold and strange, and had not a word or thought respecting her. A great black raven darted down in front of her on the high road and croaked dismally. "Ah," said she, "what bird of ill omen art thou?" Presently she passed the labourer's hut. His wife stood at the door, and the two women spoke to each other. "You look well," said the woman. "You're fat and plump. You are well off." "Oh, yes," answered Anne Lisbeth. "The boat went down with them," continued the woman. "Hans the skipper and the boy were both drowned, so there's an end of them. I always thought the boy would be able to help me with a few dollars. He'll never cost you anything more, Anne Lisbeth." "So they were drowned," repeated Anne Lisbeth, but she said no more, and the subject was dropped. She felt very low-spirited, because her Count child had shown no inclination to speak to her who loved him so well, and who had travelled so far to see him. The journey had cost money too, and she had derived no great pleasure from it. Still she said not a word of all this. She could not relieve her heart by telling the labourer's wife, lest the latter should think she did not enjoy her former position at the castle. Then the raven flew over her, screaming again as he flew. "The black wretch!" said Anne Lisbeth. "He will end by frightening me today." She had brought coffee and chicory with her, for she thought it would be a charity to the poor woman to give them to her to boil a cup of coffee, and then she would take a cup herself. The woman prepared the coffee, and in the meantime Anne Lisbeth seated her in a chair and fell asleep. Then she dreamed of something which she had never dreamed before. Singularly enough, she dreamed of her own child, who had wept and hungered in the labourer's hut, and had been knocked about in heat and in cold, and who was now lying in the depths of the sea, in a spot only known by God. She fancied she was still sitting in the hut, where the woman was busy preparing the coffee, for she could smell the coffee berries roasting. But suddenly it seemed to her that there stood on the threshold a beautiful young form, as beautiful as the Count's child, and this apparition said to her, "The world is passing away. Hold fast to me, for you are my mother after all. You have an angel in heaven, hold me fast." And the child. Angel stretched out his hand and seized her. Then there was a terrible crash, as of a world crumbling to pieces, and the angel child was rising from the earth and holding her by the sleeve so tightly that she felt herself lifted from the ground. But, on the other hand, something heavy hung to her feet and dragged her down, and it seemed as if hundreds of women were clinging to her and crying, "If thou art to be saved, we must be saved too. Hold fast, hold fast." And then they all hung on her, but there were too many, and as they clung the sleeve was torn, and Anne Lisbeth fell down in horror and awoke. Indeed, she was on the point of falling over in reality with the chair on which she sat. But she was so startled and alarmed that she could not remember what she had dreamed, only that it was something very dreadful. They drank their coffee and had a chat together, and then Anne Lisbeth went away towards the little town where she was to meet the carrier, who was to drive her back to her own home. But when she came to him, she found that he would not be ready to start till the evening of the next day. Then she began to think of the expense and what the distance would be to walk. She remembered that the route by the seashore was 2 miles shorter than by the high road, and, as the weather was clear, and there would be moonlight, she determined to make her way on foot and to start at once, that she might reach home the next day. The sun had set, and the evening bells sounded through the air from the tower of the village church. But to her it was not the bells, but the cry of the frogs in the marshes, and they ceased, and all around became still. Not a bird could be heard. They were all at rest. Even the owl had not left her hiding place. Deep silence reigned on the margin of the wood by the seashore. As Anne Lisbeth walked on, she could hear her own footsteps in the sands. Even the waves of the sea were at rest, and all in the deep waters had sunk into silence. There was quiet among the dead and the living in the deep sea. Anne Lisbeth walked on, thinking of nothing at all, as people say, or rather her thoughts wandered, but not away from her, for thought is never absent from us, it only slumbers. Many thoughts that have lain dormant are roused at the proper time, and begin to stir in the mind and the heart, and seem even to come upon us from above. It is written that a good deed bears a blessing for its fruit, and it is also written that the wages of sin is death. Much has been said and much written, which we pass over or know nothing of. A light arises within us, and then forgotten things make themselves remembered, and thus it was with Anne Lisbeth. The germ of every vice and every virtue lies in our heart, in yours and in mine. They lie like little grains of seed, till a ray of sunshine, or the touch of an evil hand, or you turn the corner to the right or to the left, and the decision is made. The little seed is stirred, it swells and shoots up and pours its sap into your blood, directing your course either for good or evil. Troublesome thoughts often exist in the mind, fermenting there, which are not realized by us while the senses are as it were slumbering, but still they are there. Anne Lisbeth walked on thus with her senses half asleep, but the thoughts were fermenting within her. From one Shrove Tuesday to another, much may occur to weigh down the heart. It is the reckoning of a whole year. Much may be forgotten. Sins against heaven in word and thought, sins against our neighbour and against our own conscience. We are scarcely aware of their existence, and Anne Lisbeth did not think of any of her errors. She had committed no crime against the law of the land. She was an honourable person, in a good position. That she knew. She continued her walk along by the margin of the sea. What was it she saw lying there? An old hat, a man's hat. Now, when might that have been washed overboard? She drew nearer. She stopped to look at the hat. Ha! What was lying yonder? She shuddered. Yet it was nothing save a heap of grass and tangled seaweed flung across a long stone. But it looked like a corpse, only tangled grass, and yet she was frightened at it. As she turned to walk away, much came into her mind that she had heard in her childhood, old superstitions of spectres by the seashore, of the ghosts of drowned but unburied people whose corpses had been washed up on the desolate beach. The body, she knew, could do no harm to anyone, but the spirit could pursue the lonely wanderer, attach itself to him, and demand to be carried to the churchyard that it might rest in consecrated ground. "Hold fast, hold fast!" the spectre would cry, and as Anne Lisbeth murmured these words to herself, the whole of her dream was suddenly recalled to her memory when the mother had clung to her and uttered these words. When, amid the crashing of worlds, her sleeve had been torn and she had slipped from the grasp of her child, who wanted to hold her up in that terrible hour? Her child, her own child, which she had never loved, lay now buried in the sea and might rise up, like a spectre, from the waters and cry, "Hold fast! Carry me to consecrated ground!" As these thoughts passed through her mind, fear gave speed to her feet, so that she walked faster and faster. Fear came upon her as if a cold, clammy hand had been laid upon her heart, so that she almost fainted. As she looked across the sea, all there grew darker. A heavy mist came rolling onwards and clung to bush and tree, distorting them into fantastic shapes. She turned and glanced at the moon, which had risen behind her. It looked like a pale, rayless surface, and a deadly weight seemed to hang upon her limbs. "Hold," thought she, and then she turned round a second time to look at the moon. A white face appeared quite close to her, with a mist hanging like a garment from its shoulders. "Stop! Carry me to consecrated earth," sounded in her ears in strange hollow tones. The sound did not come from frogs or ravens. She saw no sign of such creatures. "A grave! Dig me a grave!" was repeated quite loud. Yes, it was indeed the spectre of her child, the child that lay beneath the ocean, and whose spirit could have no rest until it was carried to the churchyard, and until a grave had been dug for it in consecrated ground. She would go there at once, and there she would dig. She turned in the direction of the church, and the weight on her heart seemed to grow lighter, and even to vanish altogether. But when she turned to go home by the shortest way, it returned. "Stop! Stop!" And the words came quite clear, though they were like the croak of a frog or the wail of a bird. "A grave! Dig me a grave!" The mist was cold and damp. Her hands and face were moist and clammy with horror. A heavy weight again seized her and clung to her. Her mind became clear for thoughts that had never before been there. In these northern regions, a beechwood often buds in a single night and appears in the morning sunlight in its full glory of youthful green. So, in a single instant, can the consciousness of the sin that has been committed in thoughts, words, and actions of our past life be unfolded to us. When once the conscience is awakened, it springs up in the heart spontaneously, and God awakens the conscience when we least expect it. Then we can find no excuse for ourselves. The deed is there and bears witness against us. The thoughts seem to become words and to sound far out into the world. We are horrified at the thought of what we have carried within us, and at the consciousness that we have not overcome the evil which has its origin in thoughtlessness and pride. The heart conceals within itself the vices as well as the virtues, and they grow in the shallowest ground. Anne Lisbeth now experienced in thought what we have closed in words. She was overpowered by them, and sank down and crept along for some distance on the ground. "A grave! Dig me a grave!" sounded again in her ears, and she would have gladly buried herself, if in the grave she could have found forgetfulness of her actions. It was the first hour of her awakening, full of anguish and horror. Superstition made her alternately shudder with cold or burn with the heat of fever. Many things, of which she had feared even to speak, came into her mind. Silently, as the cloud shadows in the moonshine, a spectral apparition flitted by her. She had heard of it before. Close by her galloped 4 snorting steeds, with fire flashing from their eyes and nostrils. They dragged a burning coach, and within it sat the wicked lord of the manor, who had ruled there 100 years before. The legend says that every night at 12 o'clock he drove into his cask yard and out again. He was not as pale as dead men are, but black as a coal. He nodded and pointed to Anne Lisbeth, crying out, hold fast, and then you may ride again in a nobleman's carriage and forget your child." She gathered herself up and hastened to the churchyard, but black crosses and black ravens danced before her eyes, and she could not distinguish one from the other. The ravens croaked as the raven had done which she saw in the daytime, but now she understood what they said. "I am the Raven Mother, I am the Raven Mother." Each raven croaked, and Anne Lisbeth felt that the name also applied to her, and she fancied she should be transformed into a black bird, and have to cry as they cried, if she did not dig the grave. And she threw herself upon the earth, and with her hands dug a grave in the hard ground, so that the blood ran from her fingers. "A grave! Dig me a grave!" still sounded in her ears. She was fearful that the cock might crow, and the first red streak appear in the east, before she had finished her work, and then she would be lost. And the cock crowed, and the day dawned in the east, and the grave was only half dug. An icy hand passed over her head and face, and down towards her heart. "Only half a grave," a voice wailed and fled away. Yes, it fled away over the sea. It was the ocean spectre, and, exhausted and overpowered, Anne Lisbeth sunk to the ground, and her senses left her. It was a bright day when she came to herself, and 2 men were raising her up, but she was not lying in the churchyard, but on the seashore, where she had dug a deep hole in the sand, and cut her hand with a piece of broken glass whose sharp stern was stuck in a little block of painted wood. Anne Lisbeth was in a fever. Conscience had roused the memories of superstitions, and had so acted upon her mind that she fancied she had only half a soul, and that her child had taken the other half down into the sea. Never would she be able to cling to the mercy of heaven till she had recovered this other half, which was now held fast in the deep water. Anne Lisbeth returned to her home, but she was no longer the woman she had been. Her thoughts were like a confused, tangled skein, only one thread, only one thought was clear to her, namely that she must carry the spectre of the seashore to the churchyard and dig a grave for him there, that by so doing she might win back her soul. Many a night she was missed from her home, and was always found on the seashore waiting for the spectre. In this way a whole year passed, and then one night she vanished again, and was not to be found. The whole of the next day was spent in a useless search after her. Towards evening, when the clerk entered the church to toll the vesper bell, he saw by the altar Anne Lisbeth, who had spent the whole day there. Her powers of body were almost exhausted, but her eyes flashed brightly, and on her cheeks was a rosy flush. The last rays of the setting sun shone upon her and gleamed over the altar upon the shining clasps of the Bible, which lay open at the words of the prophet Joel. "Rend your hearts and not your garments, and turn unto the Lord." That was just a chance, people said. But do things happen by chance? In the face of Anne Lisbeth, lighted up by the evening sun, could be seen peace and rest. She said she was happy now, for she had conquered. The spectre of the shore, her own child, had come to her the night before, and had said to her, "Thou hast dug me only half a grave, but thou hast now, for a year and a day, buried me altogether in thy heart, and it is there a mother can best hide her child." And then he gave her back her lost soul and brought her into the church. "Now I am in the house of God," she said, "and in that house we are happy." When the sun set, Anne Lisbeth's soul had risen to that region where there is no more pain, and Anne Lisbeth's troubles were at an end. Beauty of form and beauty of mind. There was once a sculptor named Alfred, who, having won the large gold medal and obtained a travelling scholarship, went to Italy, and then came back to his native land. He was young at that time. Indeed, he is young still, although he is 10 years older than he was then. On his return, he went to visit one of the little towns in the island of Zealand. The whole town knew who the stranger was, and one of the richest men in the place gave a party in his honour, and all who were of any consequence or who possessed some property were invited. It was quite an event, and all the town knew of it, so that it was not necessary to announce it by beat of drum. Apprentice boys, children of the poor, and even the poor people themselves stood before the house, watching the lighted windows, and the watchman might easily fancy he was giving a party also. There were so many people in the streets. There was quite an air of festivity about it, and the house was full of it, for Mr. Alfred, the sculptor, was there. He talked and told anecdotes, and everyone listened to him with pleasure, not unmingled with awe. But none felt so much respect for him as did the elderly widow of a naval officer. She seemed, so far as Mr. Alfred was concerned, to be like a piece of fresh blotting paper that absorbed all he said and asked for more. She was very appreciative and incredibly ignorant, a kind of female Gaspar Hauser. "I should like to see Rome," she said. "It must be a lovely city, or so many foreigners would not be constantly arriving there. Now, do give me a description of Rome. How does the city look when you enter in at the gate?" "I cannot very well describe it," said the sculptor, "but you enter on a large open space, in the centre of which stands an obelisk, which is 1,000 years old." "An organist!" exclaimed the lady, who had never heard the word obelisk. Several of the guests could scarcely forbear laughing, and the sculptor would have had some difficulty in keeping his countenance. But the smile on his lips faded away, for he caught sight of a pair of dark blue eyes close by the side of the inquisitive lady. They belonged to her daughter, and surely no one who had such a daughter could be silly. The mother was like a fountain of questions, and the daughter, who listened but never spoke, might have passed for the beautiful maid of the fountain. How charming she was! She was a study for the sculptor to contemplate, but not to converse with, for she did not speak, or, at least, very seldom. "Has the Pope a great family?" inquired the lady. The young man answered considerately, as if the question had been a different one. "No, he does not come from a great family." "That is not what I asked," persisted the widow. "I mean, has he a wife and children?" "The Pope is not allowed to marry," replied the gentleman. "I don't like that," was the lady's remark. She certainly might have asked more sensible questions, but if she had not been allowed to say just what she liked, would her daughter have been there, leaning so gracefully on her shoulder and looking straight before her, with a smile that was almost mournful on her face? Mr. Alfred again spoke of Italy, and of the glorious colours in Italian scenery, the purple hills, the deep blue of the Mediterranean, the azure of southern skies, whose brightness and glory could only be surpassed in the north by the deep blue eyes of a maiden. And he said this with a peculiar intonation. But she who should have understood his meaning looked quite unconscious of it, which also was charming. "Beautiful Italy," sighed some of the guests. "Oh, to travel there," exclaimed others. "Charming, charming," echoed from every voice. "I may perhaps win $100,000 in the lottery," said the naval officer's widow. "And if I do, we will travel. I and my daughter and you, Mr. Alfred, must be our guide. We can all three travel together, with one or two more of our good friends." And she nodded in such a friendly way at the company that each imagined himself to be the favoured person who was to accompany them to Italy. "Yes, we must go," she continued, "but not to those parts where there are robbers. We will keep to Rome. In the public roads one is always safe." The daughter sighed very gently, and how much there may be in a sigh, or attributed to it. The young man attributed a great deal of meaning to this sigh. Those deep blue eyes, which had been lit up this evening in honour of him, must conceal treasures, treasures of heart and mind, richer than all the glories of Rome. And so, when he left the party that night, he had lost it completely to the young lady. The house of the naval officer's widow was the one most constantly visited by Mr. Alfred, the sculptor. It was soon understood that his visits were not intended for that lady, though they were the persons who kept up the conversation. He came for the sake of the daughter. They called her Kaela. Her name was really Karen Malena, and these two names had been contracted into the one name Kaela. She was really beautiful, but some said she was rather dull and slept late of a morning. "She has been accustomed to that," her mother said. "She is a beauty, and they are always easily tired. She does sleep rather late, but that makes her eyes so clear." What power seemed to lie in the depths of those dark eyes? The young man felt the truth of the proverb. Still waters run deep, and his heart had sunk into their depths. He often talked of his adventures, and the mamma was as simple and eager in her questions as on the first evening they met. It was a pleasure to hear Alfred describe anything. He showed them coloured plates of Naples, and spoke of excursions to Mount Vesuvius and the eruptions of fire from it. The naval officer's widow had never heard of them before. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "So, that is a burning mountain. But is it not very dangerous to the people who live near it?" "Whole cities have been destroyed," he replied. "For instance, Herculaneum and Pompeii." "Oh, the poor people. And you saw all that with your own eyes?" "No, I did not see any of the eruptions which are represented in those pictures, but I will show you a sketch of my own, which represents an eruption I once saw." He placed a pencil sketch on the table, and mamma, who had been overpowered with the appearance of the coloured plates, threw a glance at the pale drawing and cried in astonishment, What? Did you see it throw up white fire? For a moment, Alfred's respect for Kaila's mamma underwent a sudden shock and lessened considerably, but, dazzled by the light which surrounded Kaila, he soon found it quite natural that the old lady should have no eye for colour. After all, it was of very little consequence, for Kaila's mamma had the best of all possessions, namely Kaila herself. Alfred and Kaila were betrothed, which was a very natural result, and the betrothal was announced in the newspaper of the little town. Mamma purchased 30 copies of the paper, that she might cut out the paragraph and send it to friends and acquaintances. The betrothed pair were very happy, and the mother was happy too. She said it seemed like connecting herself with Thorwaldsen. "You are a true successor of Thorwaldsen," she said to Alfred, and it seemed to him as if, in this instance, Mamma had said a clever thing. Kaila was silent, but her eyes shone, her lips smiled, every movement was graceful. In fact, she was beautiful. That cannot be repeated too often. Alfred decided to take a bust of Kaila as well as of her mother. They sat to him accordingly, and saw how he moulded and formed the soft clay with his fingers. "I suppose it is only on our account that you perform this commonplace work yourself, instead of leaving it to your servant to do all that sticking together." "It is really necessary that I should mould the clay myself," he replied. "Ah, yes, you are always so polite," said Mamma with a smile, and Kaila silently pressed his hand, all soiled as it was with the clay. Then he unfolded to them both the beauties of nature. In all her works he pointed out to them how, in the scale of creation, inanimate matter was inferior to animate nature, the plant above the mineral, the animal above the plant, and man above them all. He strove to show them how the beauty of the mind could be displayed in the outward form, and that it was the sculptor's task to seize upon that beauty of expression and produce it in his works. Kaila stood silent, but nodded in approbation of what he said, while Mamma-in-law made the following confession. "It is difficult to follow you, but I go hobbling along after you with my thoughts, though what you say makes my head whirl round and round. Still, I contrive to lay hold on some of it." Kaila's beauty had a firm hold on Alfred. It filled his soul and held a mastery over him. Beauty beamed from Kaila's every feature, glittered in her eyes, lurked in the corners of her mouth, and pervaded every movement of her agile fingers. Alfred, the sculptor, saw this. He spoke only to her, thought only of her, and the two became one. And so it may be said she spoke much, for he was always talking to her, and he and she were one. Such was the betrothal. And then came the wedding, with bridesmaids and wedding presents, all duly mentioned in the wedding speech. Mamma-in-law had set up Thorwaldsen's bust at the end of the table, attired in a dressing gown. It was her fancy that he should be a guest. Songs were sung and cheers given, for it was a gay wedding, and they were a handsome pair. "Pygmalion loved his Galatea," said one of the songs. "Ah, that is some of your mythologies," said Mamma-in-law. Next day, the youthful pair started for Copenhagen, where they were to live. Mamma-in-law accompanied them to attend to the coarse work, as she always called the domestic arrangements. Kaila looked like a doll in a doll's house, for everything was bright and new, and so fine. There they sat, all three. And as for Alfred, a proverb may describe his position. He looked like a swan amongst the geese. The magic of form had enchanted him. He had looked at the casket without caring to inquire what it contained, and that omission often brings the greatest unhappiness into married life. The casket may be injured, the gilding may fall off, and then the purchaser regrets his bargain. In a large party, it is very disagreeable to find a button giving way, with no studs at hand to fall back upon. But it is worse still in a large company to be conscious that your wife and mother-in-law are talking nonsense, and that you cannot depend upon yourself to produce a little ready wit to carry off the stupidity of the whole affair. The young married pair often sat together hand in hand. He would talk, but she could only now and then let fall a word in the same melodious voice, the same bell-like tones. It was a mental relief when Sophie, one of her friends, came to pay them a visit. Sophie was not pretty. She was, however, quite free from any physical deformity, although Keela used to say she was a little crooked, but no eye, save an intimate acquaintance, would have noticed it. She was a very sensible girl, yet it never occurred to her that she might be a dangerous person in such a house. Her appearance created a new atmosphere in the doll's house, and air was really required. They all owned that. They felt the want of a change of air, and consequently the young couple and their mother travelled to Italy. "Thank heaven we are at home again within our own four walls," said mamma-in-law and daughter both on their return after a year's absence. "There is no real pleasure in travelling," said mamma. "To tell the truth, it's very wearisome. I beg pardon for saying so. I was soon very tired of it, although I had my children with me, and, besides, it's very expensive work travelling. Very expensive. And all those galleries one is expected to see, and the quantity of things you are obliged to run after. It must be done. For very shame, you are sure to be asked when you come back if you have seen everything, and will most likely be told that you've omitted to see what was best worth seeing of all. I got tired at last of those endless Madonnas. I began to think I was turning into a Madonna myself." "And then the living, mamma," said Keila. "Yes, indeed," she replied. "No such a thing as a respectable meat soup. Their cookery is miserable stuff." The journey had also tired Keila, but she was always fatigued. That was the worst of it. So they sent for Sophie, and she was taken into the house to reside with them, and her presence there was a great advantage. Mamma-in-law acknowledged that Sophie was not only a clever housewife, but well-informed and accomplished, though that could hardly be expected in a person of her limited means. She was also a generous-hearted, faithful girl. She showed that thoroughly while Keila lay sick, fading away. When the casket is everything, the casket should be strong, or else all is over. And all was over with the casket, for Keila died. "She was beautiful," said her mother. "She was quite different from the beauties they call antiques, for they are so damaged. A beauty ought to be perfect, and Keila was a perfect beauty." Alfred wept, and mamma wept, and they both wore mourning. The black dress suited mamma very well, and she wore mourning the longest. She had also to experience another grief in seeing Alfred marry again, marry Sophie, who was nothing at all to look at. "He's gone to the very extreme," said mamma-in-law. "He has gone from the most beautiful to the ugliest, and he has forgotten his first wife. Men have no constancy. My husband was a very different man, but then he died before me. Pygmalion loved his Galatea, was in the song they sung at my first wedding," said Alfred. "I once fell in love with a beautiful statue, which awoke to life in my arms, but the kindred soul, which is a gift from heaven, the angel who can feel and sympathize with and elevate us, I have not found and won till now. You came, Sophie, not in the glory of outward beauty, though you are even fairer than is necessary. The chief thing still remains. You came to teach the sculptor that his work is but dust and clay only, an outward form made of a material that decays, and that what we should seek to obtain is the ethereal essence of mind and spirit. Poor Keila, Our life was but as a meeting by the wayside, in yonder world, where we shall know each other from a union of mind, we shall be but mere acquaintances." "That was not a loving speech," said Sophie, "nor spoken like a Christian. In a future state, where there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage, but where, as you say, souls are attracted to each other by sympathy, there everything beautiful develops itself and is raised to a higher state of existence, her soul will acquire such completeness that it may harmonize with yours, even more than mine, and you will then once more utter your first rapturous exclamation of your love. Beautiful, most beautiful. B. The almshow's window. Near the grass-covered rampart which encircles Copenhagen lies a great red house. Balsams and other flowers greet us from the long rows of windows in the house, whose interior is sufficiently poverty-stricken, and poor and old are the people who inhabit it. The building is the Wharton almshouse. Look, at the window there leans an old maid. She plucks the withered leaf from the balsam and looks at the grass-covered rampart on which many children are playing. What is the old maid thinking of? A whole life drama is unfolding itself before her inward gaze. The poor little children, how happy they are, how merrily they play and romp together, what red cheeks and what angels' eyes! But they have no shoes nor stockings. They dance on the green rampart, just on the place where, according to the old story, the ground always sank in, and where a sportive, frolicsome child had been lured by means of flowers, toys, and sweetmeats into an open grave ready dug for it, and which was afterwards closed over the child. And from that moment, the old story says, the ground gave way no longer, the mound remained firm and fast, and was quickly covered with the green turf. The little people who now play on that spot know nothing of the old tale, else would they fancy they heard a child crying deep below the earth, and the dewdrops on each blade of grass would be to them tears of woe. Nor do they know anything of the Danish king, who here, in the face of the coming foe, took an oath before all his trembling courtiers that he would hold out with the citizens of his capital and die here in his nest. They know nothing of the men who have fought here, or of the women who from here have drenched with boiling water, the enemy clad in white and biding in the snow to surprise the city. No, the poor little ones are playing with light, childish spirits. Play on, thou little maiden. Soon the years will come. Yes, those glorious years. The priestly hands have been laid on the candidates for confirmation. Hand in hand they walk on the green rampart. Thou hast a white frock on. It has cost thy mother much labour, and yet it is only cut down for thee out of an old larger dress. You will also wear a red shawl, and what if it hang too far down? People will only see how large, how very large it is. You are thinking of your dress, and of the giver of all good, so glorious is it to wander on the green rampart. And the years roll by, they have no lack of dark days, but you have your cheerful young spirit, and you have gained a friend, you know not how. You met, oh, how often! You walk together on the rampart in the fresh spring, on the high days and holidays, when all the world come out to walk upon the ramparts, and all the bells of the church steeples seem to be singing a song of praise for the coming spring. Scarcely have the violets come forth, but there on the rampart, just opposite the beautiful castle of Rosenberg, there is a tree bright with the first green buds. Every year this tree sends forth fresh green shoots. Alas, it is not so with the human heart. Dark mists, more in number than those that cover the northern skies, cloud the human heart. Poor child, thy friend's bridal chamber is a black coffin, and thou becomest an old maid. From the almshouse window behind the balsams, thou shalt look on the merry children at play, and shalt see thine own history renewed. And that is the life drama that passes before the old maid, while she looks out upon the rampart, the green, sunny rampart, where the children, with their red cheeks and bare shoeless feet, are rejoicing merrily, like the other free little birds. Children's prattle. At a rich merchant's house there was a children's party, and the children of rich and great people were there. The merchant was a learned man, for his father had sent him to college, and he had passed his examination. His father had been at first only a cattle dealer, but always honest and industrious, so that he had made money, and his son, the merchant, had managed to increase his store. Clever as he was, he had also a heart, but there was less said of his heart than of his money. All descriptions of people visited at the merchant's house, well-born as well as intellectual, and some who possessed neither of these recommendations. Now it was a children's party, and there was children's prattle, which always is spoken freely from the heart. Among them was a beautiful little girl, who was terribly proud, but this had been taught her by the servants, and not by her parents, who were far too sensible people. Her father was groom of the chambers, which is a high office at court, and she knew it. "I am a child of the court," she said. Now she might just as well have been a child of the cellar, for no one can help his birth. And then she told the other children that she was well born, and said that no one who was not well born could rise in the world. It was no use to read and be industrious, for if a person was not well born, he could never achieve anything. "And those whose names end with sen," said she, "can never be anything at all. We must put our arms akimbo and make the elbow quite pointed, so as to keep these sen people at a great distance." And then she stuck out her pretty little arms and made the elbows quite pointed, to show how it was to be done. And her little arms were very pretty, for she was a sweet-looking child. But the little daughter of the merchant became very angry at this speech, for her father's name was Peterson, and she knew that the name ended in sen, and therefore she said as proudly as she could, "But my papa can buy $100 worth of bonbons and give them away to children. Can your papa do that?" "Yes, and my papa," said the little daughter of the editor of a paper. "My papa can put your papa and everybody's papa into the newspaper. All sorts of people are afraid of him, my mamma says, for he can do as he likes with the paper." And the little maiden looked exceedingly proud, as if she had been a real princess, who may be expected to look proud. But outside the door, which stood ajar, was a poor boy, peeping through the crack of the door. He was of such a lowly station that he had not been allowed even to enter the room. He had been turning the spit for the cook, and she had given him permission to stand behind the door and peep in at the well-dressed children, who were having such a merry time within, and for him that was a great deal. "Oh, if I could be one of them," thought he. And then he heard what was said about names, which was quite enough to make him more unhappy. His parents at home had not even a penny to spare to buy a newspaper, much less could they write in one, and worse than all, his father's name, and of course his own, ended in sen, and therefore he could never turn out well, which was a very sad thought. But after all, he had been born into the world, and the station of life had been chosen for him, therefore he must be content. And this is what happened on that evening. Many years passed, and most of the children became grown-up persons. There stood a splendid house in the town, filled with all kinds of beautiful and valuable objects. Everybody wished to see it, and people even came in from the country round to be permitted to view the treasures it contained. Which of the children whose prattle we have described could call this house his own? One would suppose it very easy to guess. No, no, it is not so very easy. The house belonged to the poor little boy who had stood on that night behind the door. He had really become something great, although his name ended in sen, for it was Thorwaldsen, and the three other children, the children of good birth, of money, and of intellectual pride. Well, they were respected and honoured in the world, for they had been well provided for by birth and position, and they had no cause to reproach themselves with what they had thought and spoken on that evening long ago, for, after all, it was mere children's prattle. Delaying is not forgetting. There was an old mansion surrounded by a marshy ditch, with a drawbridge which was but seldom let down. Not all guests are good people. Under the roof were loopholes to shoot through, and to pour down boiling water or even molten lead on the enemy, should he approach. Inside the house the rooms were very high, and had ceilings of beams, and that was very useful, considering the great deal of smoke which rose up from the chimney fire where the large damp logs of wood smouldered. On the walls hung pictures of knights in armour, and proud ladies in gorgeous dresses. The most stately of all walked about alive. She was called Meta Mogan. She was the mistress of the house. To her belonged the castle. Towards the evening, robbers came. They killed 3 of her people and also the yard dog, and attached Mrs. Meta to the kennel by the chain, while they themselves made good cheer in the hall, and drank the wine and the good ale out of her cellar. Mrs. Meta was now on the chain. She could not even bark, but lo! The servant of one of the robbers secretly approached her. They must not see it, otherwise they would have killed him. "Mrs. Meta Mogan," said the fellow, "do you still remember how my father, when your husband was still alive, had to ride on the wooden horse? You prayed for him, but it was no good. He was to ride until his limbs were paralyzed. But you stole down to him, as I steal now to you. You yourself put little stones under each of his feet, that he might have support. Nobody saw it, or they pretended not to see it, for you were then the young, gracious mistress. My father has told me this, and I have not forgotten it. Now I will free you, Mrs. Meta Mogan." Then they pulled the horses out of the stable and rode off in rain and wind to obtain the assistance of friends. Thus the small service done to the old man was richly rewarded, said Meta Mogan. "Delaying is not forgetting," said the fellow. "The robbers were hanged. There was an old mansion. It is still there. It did not belong to Mrs. Meta Mogan. It belonged to another old noble family. We are now in the present time. The sun is shining on the gilt knob of the tower. Little wooded islands lie like bouquets on the water, and wild swans are swimming round them. In the garden grow roses. The mistress of the house is herself, the finest rose petal. She beams with joy, the joy of good deeds, however, not done in the wide world, but in her heart, and what is preserved there is not forgotten. Delaying is not forgetting. Now she goes from the mansion to a little peasant hut in the field. Therein lives a poor, paralyzed girl. The window of her little room looks northward. The sun does not enter here. The girl can only see a small piece of field, which is surrounded by a high fence. But today the sun shines here. The warm, beautiful sun of God is within the little room. It comes from the south through the new window where formerly the wall was. The paralyzed girl sits in the warm sunshine and can see the wood and the lake. The world had become so large, so beautiful, and only through a single word from the kind mistress of the mansion. "The word was so easy, the deed so small," she said. "The joy it afforded me was infinitely great and sweet." And therefore she does many a good deed, thinks of all in the humble cottages and in the rich mansions where there are also afflicted ones. It is concealed and hidden, but God does not forget it. Delayed is not forgotten. An old house stood there. It was in the large town with its busy traffic. There are rooms and halls in it, but we do not enter them. We remain in the kitchen, where it is warm and light, clean and tidy. The copper utensils are shining, the table as if polished with beeswax. The sink looks like a freshly scoured meat board. All this a single servant has done, and yet she has time to spare as if she wished to go to church. She wears a bow on her cap, a black bow. That signifies mourning. But she has no one to mourn, neither father nor mother, neither relations nor sweetheart. She is a poor girl. One day she was engaged to a poor fellow. They loved each other dearly. One day he came to her and said, "We both have nothing." The rich widow over the way in the basement has made advances to me. She will make me rich. But you are in my heart. What do you advise me to do? I advise you to do what you think will turn out to your happiness, said the girl. Be kind and good to her, but remember this, from the hour we part, we shall never see each other again. Years passed. Then one day she met the old friend and sweetheart in the street. He looked ill and miserable, and she could not help asking him, "How are you?" "Rich and prospering in every respect," he said. "The woman is brave and good, but you are in my heart. I have fought the battle. It will soon be ended. We shall not see each other again now until we meet before God. A week has passed. This morning his death was in the newspaper. That is the reason of the girl's mourning. Her old sweetheart is dead and has left a wife and 3 stepchildren. As the paper says, it sounds as if there is a crack, but the metal is pure. The black bow signifies mourning. The girl's face points to the same in a still higher degree. It is preserved in the heart and will never be forgotten. Delaying is not forgetting. These are 3 stories you see, 3 leaves on the same stalk. Do you wish for some more trefoil leaves? In the little heart book are many more of them. Delaying is not forgetting.